You again? I told you yesterday, this park ain't your problem, and you ain't ours. The man stepped out of the city truck with a travel mug in one hand and a ring of keys in the other. His park's maintenance polo stretched tight across his chest. 6'2", at least 230, the kind of build that came from hauling equipment all day and wanting everyone to know it. Trent Kellaway stopped 3 feet from the bench where the trash bag sat half full, nodded at the top, and stared at the young man standing next to it. Josiah Clemens didn't look up. He was bent at the waist, forearm crutch wedged under his left arm, right hand reaching for a crushed soda can lodged between the roots of a magnolia tree. His right side moved slower than his left, the arm curling inward slightly, the fingers closing with effort rather than reflex. Cerebral palsy had drawn its lines on him early, and every motion on his right side carried the visible cost of a brain that sent signals through damaged wiring. He got the can, dropped it into the bag, straightened up. Kellaway was still standing there. I heard you. Josiah's voice was quiet. Not soft, quiet. The kind of quiet that came from choosing words carefully rather than not having any. Then act like it. Kellaway pointed at the sign near the park entrance, a weathered placard bolted to a wooden post. Read that sign. This is city property. City maintained. City managed. You're not city. Josiah looked at the sign. Then he recited from memory, the words flat, precise, as though reading from a document he'd already studied. Bluff Park is maintained by the City of Natchez for the use and enjoyment of all residents. Section 4, Natchez Municipal Code, Chapter 12, Public Spaces. Kellaway's jaw tightened. He hadn't expected the kid to know the sign by heart. The truck's engine was still idling behind him. A second vehicle, a black Cadillac Escalade with tinted windows, sat in the gravel lot 60 yards away, engine running, driver's side facing the river. It hadn't been there 5 minutes ago. Kellaway glanced at it, then back at Josiah. We're done here, he said. But his voice had changed, something underneath it. Not anger. Instructions. He climbed back into the truck. Pulled away without looking back, the Escalade's engine cut off. The door opened. And the man walking toward Josiah wasn't wearing a maintenance uniform. He was wearing a suit that cost more than the house Josiah slept in. A city employee just threatened a disabled man for picking up trash in a public park. The man in the Escalade? He wasn't there to help. He was there to finish the job. If you think you know where this story is going, you're wrong. Subscribe now, because what happens to Josiah Clemens is going to make you rethink everything you believe about power, disability, and who really owns the land beneath your feet. The morning had started the way every morning started for Josiah Clemens, with pain, not the sharp dramatic kind, the slow kind, the kind that lived in his right hip and right shoulder and the tendons along his right calf, the kind that had been there since birth and would be there until death and had long since stopped being something he noticed consciously. It was just the texture of waking up. The way other people noticed cold air or stiff pillows, Josiah noticed the hemiplegia, reminding him that his body was a negotiation, not a given. He did the stretches first. 20 minutes on the floor of the shotgun house his mother had left him, the same linoleum she'd scrubbed on her knees every Saturday until the pancreatic cancer ate through her in 11 weeks. The house was narrow, 1 room wide, 4 rooms deep, the architecture of poverty designed for maximum efficiency and minimum dignity. Kitchen, living room, bedroom, bathroom, each leading directly into the next with no hallway, no separation, no privacy except what a curtain could provide. He checked the crutch, inspected the rubber tip for wear, tested the forearm cuff's tightness, made sure the adjustment pin was seated. The way someone might check equipment before deployment. Methodical, automatic, unconscious, a habit that had no obvious origin for a 23-year-old living on disability benefits and a part-time data entry contract. Water bottle filled, phone charged, and before he left, he opened the camera app, checked the storage, created a new folder, labeled it with the date, April-02-2025. The 17th consecutive daily folder, each containing time-stamped photographs that no one had asked him to take. By 5:50 a.m., he was on the cracked sidewalk, crutch clicking against concrete in a rhythm as regular as a metronome. Bluff Park was 6 blocks from the shotgun house, close enough to walk, far enough that the walk itself was a small act of endurance. The neighborhood transitioned from working-class residential to the edge of the historic district, where the houses got larger and whiter, and the cars in the driveways got newer and quieter. A jogger appeared on the opposite sidewalk. White woman, mid-40s, AirPods in, running clothes that cost more than Josiah's monthly food budget. She saw him, the crutch, the dark skin, the trash bag in his free hand, and her right hand moved to the strap of the armband, holding her phone. A micro-adjustment, the kind of motion that wasn't conscious but wasn't accidental either. The body's learned response to a perceived category of threat. She passed, didn't nod, didn't wave. Just the hand on the strap and the quickened pace and the eyes that found the middle distance and stayed there. Josiah noticed. He always noticed, and he kept walking. Bluff Park sat on a natural terrace above the Mississippi River, 12 acres of grass and old-growth trees and crumbling infrastructure that had once been the pride of Natchez and was now the embarrassment no one wanted to fund. The playground equipment had been tagged out of service since January, orange stickers on the swings, padlocks on the climbing structure, yellow caution tape flapping in the wind like surrender flags. The trash cans overflowed every 3 days because the pickup schedule had been cut from daily to bi-weekly in the last budget cycle. Mowing had stopped entirely 4 months ago, leaving the grass knee-high in patches and matted flat where people still walked. The decline wasn't accidental. Josiah had figured that out in the first week. Parks that got funding stayed open. Parks that got neglected got redeveloped. And Bluff Park sat on 12 acres of Riverview land that, according to the Adams County Tax Assessor's website, which Josiah had checked, was valued at approximately $14 million if rezoned for residential mixed use. He'd started cleaning 17 days ago. No announcement, no social media post, no organization behind him. Just a young man with a crutch and a trash bag and the stubborn conviction that letting a public space rot because powerful people wanted it to rot was not something he could watch happen without acting. The first few days, nobody noticed. By day 5, the elderly black women from the neighborhood, the ones who remembered when the park had a bandstand and summer concerts and a maintenance crew that actually maintained, started leaving water bottles on the bench near the magnolia tree. No note, no conversation. Just water, there when he arrived, cold from someone's refrigerator. By day 10, the complaints started. Not from the neighborhood, from the bluffs, the row of antebellum homes and newer McMansions that lined the ridge above the park, their manicured lawns looking down on the green space like sentinels guarding territory. Pamela Overstreet lived in the largest of these, a renovated colonial with a wraparound porch from which she could see every corner of Bluff Park, and, apparently, felt entitled to control every corner too. She'd started with phone calls. Not to Josiah, she'd never spoken to him directly, to the city, to the Parks Department, to Alderman Boyd Jernigan, whose district included the Bluffs, and who returned her calls within the hour. The complaints were carefully worded. Concern for safety, concern for liability, concern that an unsupervised individual with physical limitations was performing manual labor near children, weaponizing his disability, making his body the problem. Josiah knew about the calls because Pastor Calvin Boyce at Mount Olive Baptist had heard about them through the church's informal network, the same network that tracked which city services were being cut, which roads weren't getting repaired, and which aldermen were returning whose calls. Boyce had told Josiah carefully, the way you tell someone that the water they're swimming in has sharks. People are talking, Boyce had said, sitting on the bench by the magnolia tree while Josiah worked. Overstreet's got 40-something signatures on a petition. Josiah had kept picking up trash. A petition for what? Safety concerns. Unauthorized activity in the park. Picking up litter is unauthorized? Boyce had looked at him with the expression of a man who'd spent 61 years in Mississippi and had long since stopped being surprised by the creative ways power protected itself. Son, everything's unauthorized when the wrong person does it. That had been 3 days ago. Now the Escalade was here, and the man in the suit was walking toward Josiah with the confident stride of someone who owned things, buildings, companies, people's attention, and expected the world to arrange itself around that ownership. Mr. Clemens? The man extended his hand. His grip was firm, practiced, the handshake of boardrooms and golf courses. Nolan Driscoll. I'm a developer working on some projects in the Natchez area. Mind if we talk for a minute? Josiah didn't take the hand immediately. He looked at it, then at the man, then at the Escalade with its tinted windows and its driver still sitting inside. Then he shifted his crutch, freed his left hand, and shook. You know my name, Josiah said. I do my research. Driscoll smiled. Perfect teeth. The smile of a man who'd learned long ago that warmth was a tool, not a feeling. I've been watching what you're doing here. Every morning, rain or shine. Impressive commitment. It's just trash. It's more than trash, and we both know it. Driscoll reached into his jacket, Italian wool, charcoal gray, the kind of fabric that didn't wrinkle, and produced an envelope. Inside, a cashier's check. $5,000. Made out to Josiah Clemens. For your trouble, Driscoll said. Consider it a thank you for keeping the park presentable. I know times are tight. Josiah looked at the check, then at Driscoll. I don't need payment for picking up litter in a public park. Everyone needs something, Mr. Clemens. What I need is for the city to maintain this park the way it's supposed to. He handed the check back. The motion was smooth, left hand steady, no hesitation. The refusal wasn't dramatic. It was administrative, like declining a form that didn't apply. Something shifted behind Driscoll's eyes. The smile stayed, but the warmth drained out of it the way color drains from the sky before a storm. Slowly, and then all at once. That park's going to change whether you're in it or not. He took the check back, slid it into his jacket, and straightened his cuffs. I'm trying to be generous here. Not many people in your position turn down $5,000. My position. Your situation. Limited mobility. Fixed income. A house that needs more work than it's worth. He said it the way a doctor reads test results. Clinical, detached, as though Josiah's entire life could be reduced to a set of deficits. I'm offering you an exit, a comfortable one. From what? Driscoll looked at the park, the overgrown grass, the locked playground, the river beyond. He looked at it the way a man looks at property he's already bought in his mind. From a fight you can't win. He walked back to the escalade. The door closed, the engine started, the gravel crunched, and then the lot was empty again. Just Josiah and the magnolia tree and the half-full trash bag and the morning light turning the Mississippi gold. Josiah pulled out his phone, opened the camera, took a photograph of the gravel lot where the Escalade had been parked, the tire tracks, the timestamp, the angle. Then he opened the daily folder and added it to the sequence. 17 days of photographs, license plates, maintenance schedules, mowing patterns, or the absence of them. The dates when trash cans were emptied versus the dates they should have been emptied, according to the posted schedule on the Parks Department website. Nobody had asked him to keep these records. Nobody knew he was keeping them. Across the street, on the wraparound porch of the renovated Colonial, Pamela Overstreet watched the Escalade disappear around the corner. Then she picked up her phone and dialed a number she had on speed dial. The phone rang twice. Boyd? It's Pamela. He turned down the money. A pause on the other end. Then, that changes things. 2 days later, the volunteer permit demand arrived. Josiah was at the park entrance at 5:45 a.m., same as always, when Kellaway's city truck pulled across the gravel path, blocking the entrance. Not parked nearby, not idled to the side. Physically blocking the path, the truck's bumper 6 inches from the wooden post that held the park sign. Kellaway got out with a clipboard. Morning, Mr. Clemens. The formality was new, performative. The kind of language that showed up in incident reports. Before you proceed today, I need to inform you of a policy change. Josiah waited. Effective immediately. Any volunteer activity on city property requires a volunteer service permit. Form VSP-12. You'll need to file an application with the Parks Department, include proof of liability insurance, and submit to a background check. The clipboard had a single sheet of paper on it. Not a city form, not a printed ordinance, just a typed paragraph on plain white paper with no letterhead, no city seal, no signature line. What's the code section? Josiah asked. Kellaway's eyes went to the clipboard, then back to Josiah. It's department policy. Policies are based on ordinances. Ordinances have code sections. What's the section? The silence lasted 4 seconds. Kellaway's thumb rubbed the edge of the clipboard, the small fidget of a man who'd been given a script but hadn't memorized the footnotes. You can take that up with the Parks Department, City Hall, Monday through Friday, 8 to 4:30. I will. And he did. That morning, after his cleanup, because he cleaned the park first, walking around the truck that blocked the entrance by taking the grass path along the riverbank, Josiah went to City Hall. The Adams County Courthouse and Natchez City Hall shared a building on South Wall Street, a brick structure with white columns that looked exactly like what it was, a monument to a particular kind of Southern authority that hadn't changed as much as its architecture suggested. Inside, the hallways smelled of floor wax and old paper and the particular bureaucratic staleness that accumulates in buildings where forms are more important than people. The city clerk's office was on the first floor. Cora Linden sat behind a desk cluttered with file trays and a desktop computer that looked like it belonged in a museum exhibit about the early 2000s. She was 43, thin in the way that suggested nervous energy rather than fitness, with reading glasses perched on her nose and a manner that communicated, with every gesture, that your presence was an interruption. I'd like to request a volunteer service permit application, Josiah said. Form VSP-12? Linden looked at him over the glasses, took in the crutch, the dark skin, the worn jacket, The quiet steadiness of his voice, which didn't quite match the rest of the picture. A what? Volunteer service permit. I was told by Parks Maintenance that it's required for volunteer activity on city property. I'm not aware of that form. She turned to her computer, typed something, waited. Typed something else. No. We don't have a Form VSP-12 in our system. Then no permit is required? Lyndon's fingers paused on the keyboard. Her eyes flicked to something Josiah couldn't see. The phone on her desk, which had a small light blinking, a message waiting. Let me check with the department. Can you come back this afternoon? He came back at 2:15. Lyndon had changed her story. I found it, the volunteer service permit. It's a new form, just implemented. But applications take 6 to 8 weeks to process. 6 to 8 weeks. Background checks, liability review, standard processing time. Josiah looked at the form she'd printed. It had a city seal on it now. Photocopied, slightly crooked, the kind of addition that happened when someone created a document in a hurry and needed it to look official. The form asked for full legal name, social security number, proof of residence, proof of liability insurance with minimum coverage of $1 million, 3-character references, and a statement of purpose not to exceed 500 words. $1 million in liability insurance. For picking up trash in a public park. He took the form, folded it carefully, put it in his jacket pocket. Then he said evenly, without raising his voice, Mississippi Code Section 21-37-3 establishes that public parks are open to all residents for ordinary and customary use, without permit or prior authorization. Picking up litter qualifies as ordinary use. This form has no legal basis. Lyndon's face went still, the particular stillness of someone who has been told something they already know, but didn't expect to hear from the person standing in front of them. I'm just the clerk, Mr. Clemens. I don't make policy. No, but you process forms, and this form didn't exist until this morning. He left. Behind him, the blinking light on Lyndon's phone went out. She'd already made the call. That evening, Josiah sat on his mother's porch, the wood soft in places, the railing held together more by paint than structural integrity, and read the fabricated form one more time. Then he photographed it, front and back, date-stamped, filed it in the day's folder alongside the photographs of Kellaway's truck blocking the entrance, the tire tracks from Driscoll's Escalade, and a screenshot of the Parks Department website showing the official volunteer policy, which mentioned no such permit, no insurance requirement, and no application process. His phone buzzed. A text from Pastor Boyce. Heard about the permit thing. Also heard Overstreet's petition is going to the Neighborhood Association meeting Thursday. You're not invited, Josiah typed back. I know. He didn't elaborate. Didn't ask how Boyce knew. Didn't express surprise or anger or frustration. Just 2 words and then silence. The phone dark on the porch railing. The river sounds rising through the dusk. The Neighborhood Association met at the Bluffs Community Room, a converted carriage house behind Pamela Overstreet's property that served as both social club and power center for the 12-block radius of wealth that looked down on the park. 28 residents attended, all white, all homeowners, all voters in Alderman Jernigan's district. Overstreet presided from the head of a long table, her silver hair pinned back, her reading glasses on a chain, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of making demands sound like concerns. The petition has 47 signatures as of this afternoon, she announced. I forwarded copies to Alderman Jernigan's office, the Parks Department, and the Natchez Police Department. The petition was 2 pages. Josiah hadn't seen it. He wasn't invited, and it wasn't a public document. But Pastor Boyce had obtained a copy through a church member who worked as a housekeeper in the Bluffs. The language was careful, lawyered, designed to sound reasonable while accomplishing something unreasonable. We, the undersigned residents of the Bluffs neighborhood, express concern regarding unauthorized and unsupervised activity in Bluff Park by an individual with physical limitations who has been observed performing manual labor near children's play areas. We request the City of Natchez take immediate action to address potential liability, safety concerns, and unauthorized use of municipal equipment and facilities. Physical limitations, near children, liability, safety, every word chosen to transform a man picking up trash into a threat, not by saying he was a threat, but by surrounding him with the vocabulary of threat until the distinction disappeared. The individual in question has been informed of the permit requirement, Overstreet continued. He has refused to comply. Actually, said a voice from the back of the room, he filed an application today. The room turned. Pastor Calvin Boyce stood near the door, his presence itself a message. He hadn't been invited either, but the meeting was held in a room that, despite its private feel, was technically open to residents who asked. He'd asked, "Pastor Boyce." Overstreet's smile was made of porcelain. "I didn't realize you'd be joining us." "Just observing. Community interest." He didn't sit down, didn't move further into the room, just stood by the door with his hands clasped and his expression neutral and his 61 years of navigating white spaces visible in the careful way he held his shoulders, neither deferential nor confrontational, occupying the precise middle ground that black men in Mississippi learned or didn't survive. "As I was saying," Overstreet continued, turning back to the table, "the next step is a formal request to the Parks Department for restricted access during the assessment period." "Boyd?" Alderman Boyd Jernigan sat at the far end of the table, reading glasses low on his nose, a legal pad in front of him covered in notes. 48, lean, the kind of man who stayed thin through tension rather than exercise. He'd served on the Parks and Recreation Committee for 6 years and chaired it for the last 2, a position that gave him authority over maintenance budgets, vendor contracts, and, crucially, the approval process for any changes to park access or use. "I'll convene an emergency session of the Parks Committee," Jernigan said. "We can draft an ordinance restricting non-permitted volunteer activity for liability reasons." "How fast?" Overstreet asked. "I can have it on the agenda within the week." Boyce cleared his throat. "The young man is picking up litter in a public park that the city hasn't maintained in 4 months." The room went quiet. Not the quiet of reflection, the quiet of people deciding how to respond to a statement that was both undeniably true and deeply inconvenient. "That's exactly the concern," Jernigan said, his voice smooth, practiced. "If the city isn't maintaining the park to standard, and a private citizen injures himself performing maintenance activities, the liability exposure is significant. The Mississippi Tort Claims Act, Section 11-46-1, limits sovereign immunity but doesn't eliminate it. We need to protect the city's interest. Legal language deployed as armor. Josiah's well-being framed as the city's financial risk. The trick was old, but it still worked. Turn the victim into the liability and the neglect into prudence." Boyce said nothing more. He'd made his point. The room had heard it. Whether they'd act on it was another matter entirely. He left the way he'd arrived, quietly, through the door, into the evening air that smelled of magnolia and river mud and the particular sweetness of a Mississippi spring that didn't care about politics. The Parks and Recreation Committee convened 6 days later in the City Hall conference room. 4 members present, Jernigan as chair, 2 allies, and Councilwoman Alma Gaines, who sat at the end of the table with her arms crossed and her expression suggesting she'd rather be anywhere else. The agenda had 1 item. Emergency Ordinance, authorization requirements for volunteer maintenance activity in municipal green spaces. Jernigan presented the proposal with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd written the conclusion before conducting the review. The ordinance would require any individual performing maintenance, beautification, or physical labor in a city park to obtain prior written authorization from the Parks Department, carry proof of liability insurance, and submit to a background verification process. The penalty for violation, criminal trespass under Mississippi Code, Section 97-17-87. There was a public comment period. 3 residents spoke in favor, all from the Bluffs, all signatories to Overstreet's petition. Their comments followed the same template: safety, liability, proper channels. Josiah was the 4th speaker. He'd arrived early, signed the comment sheet, and waded through the 3 preceding statements with the stillness of someone accustomed to waiting. When his name was called, he stood, positioned his crutch, and approached the microphone at the front of the room. He'd brought a printed copy. Natchez Municipal Code, Chapter 12, Section 4, establishes that public parks are open to all residents for ordinary and customary use. He read from the document, his voice level, unhurried. The Mississippi Supreme Court has consistently held that activities incidental to the enjoyment of public spaces, including light maintenance such as litter collection, do not constitute regulated activity requiring permitting. Jernigan cut in. "Mr. Clemens, your time." Furthermore, the proposed ordinance creates an access barrier that disproportionately impacts residents with disabilities, potentially violating Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which prohibits exclusion from public services, programs, or activities on the basis of disability. "Mr. Clemens, your time is up." Jernigan's voice was harder now. He hadn't expected a citation of federal law. He'd expected a personal appeal, an emotional argument that could be dismissed as uninformed. What he got instead was statutory language delivered with the precision of someone who'd read the code more than once. "I've only used 1 minute and 47 seconds of my 3 minutes, Josiah said. "Time's up." Jernigan looked at the committee. "Shall we proceed to a vote?" The vote was 3-1. Gaines dissented, her no crisp and unambiguous. The ordinance passed, draft status, pending full council review. Josiah gathered his printed copy, walked to the exit. At the door, he paused and looked back, not at Jernigan, not at the committee, but at the wall behind them, where a framed photograph showed Bluff Park in 1978, full of children and families and green grass maintained to a standard that didn't exist anymore. He photographed the committee room's agenda board with his phone. Date stamped, filed, then he left. The escalation didn't begin with violence. It began with subtraction. The water bottles stopped appearing on the bench. Not all at once. First the brand changed, then the frequency dropped from daily to every other day, then they stopped entirely. Someone had spoken to the elderly women who left them. Someone had made the cost of small kindness higher than the kindness itself. The community garden adjacent to the park, a shared plot maintained by 6 families from the south side, padlocked its water spigot on a Monday morning. No explanation posted, no meeting called, just a padlock where there hadn't been one before, on a spigot Josiah had been using to rinse his hands after handling trash. When he asked Mrs. Delphine Rourke, who managed the garden, she looked at the ground and said she was sorry. She'd been told there were insurance issues with non-members accessing the water. Insurance issues. The same language, the same phantom liability that kept appearing whenever someone needed a reason to say no without saying why. The hardware store on Franklin Street, the only one within walking distance that sold the heavy-duty trash bags Josiah used, ran out of stock on a Tuesday, still out on Wednesday, Thursday too. The owner, Glenn Pfeiffer, met Josiah's eyes and said, "Supply chain problems," which was a sentence that meant nothing and explained everything. Josiah ordered bags online. They arrived in 2 days. The supply chain, apparently, functioned perfectly when it didn't have to pass through Natchez. Then came the email. Josiah's data entry client, a medical billing company in Jackson that contracted remote workers for overflow processing, received an anonymous message on April 7th. The subject line read, "Concern regarding contractor Josiah Clemens." The body was 3 sentences. "We are writing to express concern about the reliability and judgment of your contractor Josiah Clemens, currently involved in a dispute with the city of Natchez. His recent arrest raises questions about his fitness for handling sensitive medical data. We recommend you review his contract immediately. No signature, no return address that traced to a real person, just enough institutional language to sound official, and enough implied threat to make an HR department nervous." The client called Josiah that afternoon. A woman named Sandra, whose voice carried the distinctive discomfort of someone who liked him personally, but answered to people who didn't know him at all. "We're not terminating your contract." Sandra paused, and the pause carried weight. "But we're putting it on hold pending review. Standard procedure when a contractor's involved in legal matters." "I was arrested for picking up trash in a public park." Josiah kept his voice level. "I understand that, but the email raised questions, and our compliance team needs to—" "Sandra, someone sent that email specifically to get this result. There is no compliance issue." "I know, I believe you, but I don't make these decisions alone." The contract was paused. Income, gone. Not permanently, probably, but gone for now, at exactly the moment when legal costs and daily survival competed for the same shrinking pool of resources. Josiah forwarded the anonymous email to himself, preserving the metadata, the routing headers, the timestamp, and filed it in the daily folder. Then he opened a spreadsheet and mapped the timeline. Padlock on April 5th. Store out of stock on April 6th. Anonymous email on April 7th. Each event separated by exactly 1 day. Coordinated, sequential. The work of someone following a checklist. He didn't know who held the checklist, but the pattern pointed in a direction, and directions, given enough documentation, eventually pointed to names. 2 days after the contract was paused, Overstreet made her next move. A new petition appeared. Not the original safety concern version, but an escalation. This one was addressed to the Natchez Board of Aldermen and requested immediate enforcement action against individuals conducting unauthorized maintenance in city parks. What's wow, it included a cover letter written on Bluff's Neighborhood Association letterhead, signed by Overstreet as president, with a CC line that read, "Captain Russ Delacroix, Natchez PD, Patrol Division." She'd copied the police, not as a report, as an instruction. The physical escalation began at the park itself 3 days later. Kellaway arrived early that morning, 5:30 a.m., 15 minutes before Josiah's usual arrival. He drove the maintenance truck past the entrance and directly onto the grass, leaving tire tracks through the section Josiah had cleaned the previous day. Then he opened the truck's bed, pulled out 4 bags of landscape debris, branches, dead leaves, cut grass from a different site, and dumped them across the path. When Josiah arrived at 5:45, the path was covered. Not randomly, deliberately. The debris was concentrated in the exact area he'd been cleaning for the past 3 weeks, the section nearest the bench where elderly residents sat, the section he could reach most easily with his limited mobility. Josiah stood at the edge of the debris, looked at it, looked at the tire tracks leading to and from the maintenance truck, which was now parked 50 yards away with Kellaway leaning against the driver's door, arms crossed, watching. He started cleaning. Again. The same section. The same work. Branches that his left hand could grab while his right arm stabilized the crutch. Leaves that he kicked into piles with his left foot, then bent, slowly, painfully, to scoop into the bag. It took 40 minutes to redo what Kellaway had undone in 3. This happened 3 days in a row. Each morning Kellaway arrived early. Each morning the debris was placed in the same section. Each morning Josiah cleaned it. No confrontation, no shouting. Just the silent war of a man with institutional power trying to break a man who had nothing but persistence. On the 4th morning, Kellaway changed the strategy. He didn't dump debris. He parked the maintenance truck directly in Josiah's path, engine running, diesel exhaust blowing across the area where Josiah worked. When Josiah moved to a different section, Kellaway moved the truck, blocking, following, using the vehicle as a weapon of intimidation without touching him. "You're in my work zone," Kellaway said through the truck's open window. "This area is scheduled for maintenance. You need to clear out." The maintenance schedule is posted on the city website. Josiah didn't look at the truck, kept working. "This park isn't scheduled for any maintenance activity this month. Or next month." Kellaway got out of the truck, walked around the front, stopped 2 feet from Josiah. "I'm telling you to move. And I'm telling you, there's no legal basis for that request." The shove came fast, not a punch, not a full-body hit, but a flat palm push to Josiah's left shoulder that drove him sideways. The crutch caught in soft ground where the sprinklers had run overnight, the rubber tip sinking into mud, and for a terrible second Josiah was falling, the world tilting, his right side unable to compensate, gravity winning the argument that balance was trying to make. He didn't fall. His left hand caught the bench, the same bench where the water bottles appeared each morning, and he held himself there, half standing, half leaning, the crutch stuck in mud, and his right arm curled against his chest in the involuntary spasm that came when his body was jolted. 2 joggers had stopped on the path behind Kellaway, a man and a woman, both in their 30s, both staring. Josiah straightened, pulled the crutch free, looked at Kellaway, without raising his voice, without changing his expression, without any of the things that would have been justified and natural and human. "You just assaulted a person with a disability on city property. There are 2 joggers behind you who saw it." Kellaway's head snapped around. The joggers were already pulling out their phones. He stepped back, his hands went to his sides, the posture of a man who just realized the difference between what he could do in private and what he'd just done in front of witnesses. "That was an accident," he said. "Was it?" Josiah's voice was flat, not a question. Kellaway returned to the truck. The engine revved. The tires bit into wet grass, leaving deep grooves. He was gone before the joggers could approach. They came over anyway. "Are you okay?" The woman reached for Josiah's arm. He stepped back, not rudely, but deliberately. The arm she'd reached for was the right one, the one with limited sensation, and being grabbed there by strangers triggered a reflex he'd learned to manage but couldn't eliminate. "I'm fine. Thank you. We saw what happened. That guy pushed you. Do you want us to call the police?" Josiah almost smiled. The kind of smile that wasn't humor, but something closer to the recognition of irony. "I don't think the police would help in this particular situation, but I appreciate the offer." He asked for their names. They gave them. Marcus and Janelle Webb, married, lived on Homochito Street, ran together every morning at 6. He entered their names and phone numbers into his phone, added a note in the daily folder. Witnesses: Kellaway assault, Bluff Park, 6:08 a.m. The arrest came 12 days later. The trespass sign appeared first. Kellaway installed it on a Thursday afternoon, a laminated sheet zip-tied to the park entrance post, directly below the original city sign. Block letters, red background, white text. No trespassing. Authorized personnel only. No city seal. No ordinance number. No date. No signature. No citation to the code section that would make it legally binding. Josiah photographed it that evening. Then he pulled out the printed text of Mississippi Code Section 97-17-87 and read it aloud, quietly, to no one in particular, or to the phone's voice memo app, which was recording. A person is guilty of trespass if, after being ordered to leave by the owner or authorized agent, refuses to do so. Bluff Park is a public park. The city of Natchez is the owner. This sign has no city seal, no authorizing signature, no code citation. It is not a legal trespass notice under Mississippi law. He left the sign in place, didn't touch it, didn't argue with it, just documented it and kept cleaning. The next morning was a Friday, April 9th, 2025. Josiah arrived at 6:15 a.m. Captain Russ Delacroix was waiting. 2 patrol cars were parked at the entrance, lights off, engines idling. Delacroix stood between them. 53, gray crew cut, the kind of officer whose posture communicated that he'd been doing this longer than you'd been alive and didn't appreciate being told how it worked. His uniform was pressed. His badge caught the early light. His face was the practiced neutral of a man who had already decided what was going to happen and was performing the formality of making it look like a conversation. "Mr. Clemens," Delacroix held a clipboard. "I have a signed complaint from a resident alleging criminal trespass on city property. I'm going to need you to leave the park." Under what authority was the trespass designation made? Josiah's voice was calm, steady. The question was precise, not why, but under what authority. Oh, a distinction that most people wouldn't notice and that mattered enormously. Mississippi Code 97-17-87 requires the owner or authorized agent to issue a lawful order. Who signed the trespass notice? Delacroix didn't answer the question. He glanced at the trespass sign, the one without a city seal, without an ordinance number, without legal weight, and then back at Josiah. "You can sort that out with a judge. Turn around." "Am I under arrest?" "You're being detained." "For what crime?" "Criminal trespass. Miss Code 97-17-87. You've been notified and you're still here. That sign doesn't constitute lawful notice. There's no—" "Turn around. Hands behind your back." The 2 officers from the patrol cars moved in, one on each side. Practiced choreography, the kind that came from training videos and repetition and the institutional confidence that the badge made the law rather than followed it. Josiah put the trash bag down, set his crutch against the bench, turned around. The first officer grabbed his left wrist. Standard procedure, quick, efficient. The handcuff ratcheted, once, twice. Then the second officer reached for his right wrist, pulled it behind his back. The right arm didn't go easily. It never went easily. Hemiplegia meant the muscles on that side were tighter, the range of motion smaller, the joints less willing to be forced into positions the brain couldn't fully control. The officer pulled harder. Josiah's shoulder made a sound, not a crack, not a pop, but a grinding resistance that was audible in the morning quiet. "My right arm has limited mobility." Josiah's voice didn't break, didn't rise, didn't beg. "The ADA requires reasonable accommodation during detention. Front cuffing is an accepted alternative for individuals with upper limb disabilities." Delacroix stood 10 feet away, watching. His jaw moved once, a small chewing motion, like a man working on a thought he didn't want to say out loud. "Cuff him and process him," he said. The right wrist was forced behind his back. The handcuff closed, too tight, the metal biting into skin that had less sensation than the left, but still had enough to register pain. Josiah's right hand went numb within 30 seconds. He didn't say anything more about accommodation. He'd made the statement. It was on record, at least in his memory, and in the memory of anyone within earshot. The 2 officers walked him toward the patrol car. The crutch stayed behind, leaning against the bench, looking like a piece of someone left behind. "His crutch," one of the officers said, half turning. "We'll collect it as property," Delacroix said. "After processing." After. Not now. Not when the person who needed it to walk was being put in a vehicle. After. They helped him into the back seat the way they'd help any arrestee, which is to say, they didn't accommodate the fact that his right leg moved differently than his left, that ducking into a patrol car required balance he could only maintain with the crutch they'd left on the bench, that the plastic seat was designed for people whose bodies cooperated with gravity in ways his didn't. His right knee hit the doorframe, a sharp crack of bone against metal that sent a jolt up his thigh and made his hip seize. The spasticity response that came when unexpected impact overloaded his already compromised nervous system. He didn't cry out. His teeth clenched and his breath caught, and his right leg went rigid for 3 seconds while the neural storm passed. The officer behind him, young, maybe 25, name tag reading done, put a hand on Josiah's head and pushed. Standard procedure for getting arrestees into vehicles. Completely wrong for someone whose balance depended on a crutch that was 50 yards away, leaning against a bench. Josiah's right side collapsed. He fell sideways onto the seat, his cuffed hands trapped behind him, taking his weight in a way that ground the metal deeper into both wrists. His right shoulder, the one with limited range, the one that had already been forced into an unnatural position by the handcuffs, made a sound like wet rope being twisted. "Careful." That was the second officer. Female. Name tag, Patterson. Her voice carried something the others didn't. Not sympathy exactly, but the recognition that what was happening wasn't standard. That the gap between procedure and cruelty had gotten thin enough to see through. "He's fine," Dunn said. He closed the door. Josiah lay on his side in the back seat for 8 seconds before he could push himself upright. The seatbelt wasn't offered. The partition mesh was cold against his forehead when the car accelerated. His right hand had gone completely numb. Not the tingling of poor circulation, but the dead absence that meant nerve compression, the cuffs cutting into the exact spot where the radial nerve ran close to the surface. He cataloged the violations silently. Failure to accommodate disability during arrest, ADA Title II. Excessive force in handcuffing, potential 8th Amendment. Denial of mobility device, additional ADA violation. Failure to activate body cam at point of contact, department policy violation. Improper vehicle entry assistance, Department Training Manual, Section 12. Arrestees with physical limitations. He knew the section number. He knew all the section numbers. He sat. The door closed. The engine idled. Through the mesh partition, Josiah could see Delacroix standing by the bench, looking at the crutch, then at the trespass sign, then at his phone, where he typed something short, a text or an email, quick enough to be routine, careful enough to be calculated. The patrol car pulled away. The park shrank in the rear window. The magnolia tree. The bench. The crutch, still leaning where he'd placed it, waiting for someone who was no longer there to pick it up. This man was arrested for picking up trash in a public park that the city abandoned. If that doesn't make your blood boil, wait until you hear what they found on the body cam footage. Stay with me. Booking took 4 hours, not because the process was long, but because the process was deliberately slowed. The Natchez Police Department processed misdemeanor arrests at its main station on South Commerce Street, a single-story brick building with fluorescent lights and linoleum floors, and the smell of burnt coffee that seemed to be a constitutional requirement of every police station in the American South. The desk sergeant, a heavy-set man named Trujillo, whose nameplate was slightly crooked, handled the intake with the methodical indifference of someone who had booked thousands of people and viewed each one as a file number rather than a human being. Fingerprints. Josiah's right hand didn't cooperate, the fingers curled, the grip weak, the fine motor control that fingerprinting required simply not available on that side. Trujillo pressed harder, rolled the fingers himself, forcing them flat against the ink pad with a grip that left red marks on Josiah's wrist. "My right hand has limited dexterity," Josiah said, the same calm tone, the same flat precision. "If you use the digital scanner, the results will be more accurate. We use the ink pad here." Trujillo didn't look up. Photograph. They made him stand without the crutch, which was still in the patrol car, listed as property to be collected on the intake form. Standing without the crutch meant standing with his right leg bearing weight it couldn't fully bear, his balance compromised, his posture the asymmetric stance of someone whose body was fighting itself just to stay upright. "I need my crutch to stand properly," Josiah said. "Stand against the wall. Look at the camera." 3 attempts. Each time, Trujillo said the lighting was wrong or the angle was off. Each time, Josiah stood there, balancing on one good leg and one compromised one, his right arm against his side, his face showing nothing. Not defiance, not defeat. Just the patience of someone who understood that this was theater and that theater eventually ended. By the 3rd attempt, his right leg was shaking, not visibly to someone who didn't know what to look for, but measurably, the micro-tremors that came when fatigued muscles lost the battle with gravity. His right knee buckled once, a half-second dip that he corrected by shifting his weight entirely to his left side. The posture this created was ungainly, lopsided, the kind of stance that a booking photo would make permanent. A disabled man off balance, captured in the flattest light imaginable, looking exactly the way they wanted him to look, like he didn't belong upright. "Good enough." Trujillo pressed the shutter. The holding cell was 8 by 10. Concrete bench, no padding. Stainless steel toilet with no privacy screen. The temperature was 63 degrees. Josiah knew because his body told him, the cold settling into his right side first, the way it always did, the compromised muscles losing heat faster than the functional ones. He sat on the concrete bench with his back against the wall and his legs extended, and his hands, still cuffed, still behind his back, still numb on the right side, pressed against cold stone. The bench was 18 inches off the floor, too high for his right leg to touch the ground comfortably, too low for his feet to dangle without pressure on his knees. Designed for average bodies. His body had never been average. 4 hours. No one checked on him. No one offered water. No one asked if the cuffs were still too tight, or if his right arm, which had been pinned behind his back for going on 90 minutes, had regained any feeling. At hour 2, he asked the officer monitoring the cells, a young woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else, for a restroom accommodation. "You have a toilet in the cell. I need assistance standing from a seated position without my crutch. My right leg doesn't bear weight independently." She looked at him, looked at the cell, looked at her shoes. "I'll ask the sergeant." She didn't come back for 40 minutes. When she did, she brought the crutch. Not because the sergeant had authorized it, because she'd retrieved it from the patrol car herself, signed it out of the property log, and brought it to the cell block without asking anyone's permission. "Here." She passed it through the meal slot. Her name tag read, Fontenot. She didn't say anything else, didn't make eye contact again, but the crutch was there, and that mattered more than any word she could have offered. Small mercy. The kind that individual conscience produces when institutional policy fails. The kind that shouldn't be necessary, and always is. Property inventory. His phone, the phone with 17 days of date-stamped photographs, with the fabricated permit form, with the witness contacts, with the voice memo of him reading the trespass statute, was placed in a clear plastic bag and logged. "I want to note for the record that my phone contains documentation relevant to this arrest," Josiah said. "I request that it be preserved as potential evidence." Trujillo wrote something on the property form. Whether it was what Josiah had asked him to write was impossible to verify from where Josiah stood. The phone call came 3 hours into booking. Georgia code didn't apply here. This was Mississippi. But the principle was the same. Mississippi rules of criminal procedure required access to a phone within a reasonable time after arrest. Josiah was given the phone at the desk sergeant's station. He dialed a number from memory, not from his phone, which was sealed in the property bag, but from memory. A 202 area code. Washington, D.C. The phone rang 4 times. Voicemail. Josiah left a message. 12 words. "This is Clemens, Natchez, arrested Bluff Park. Trespass charge, need update." He hung up. Trujillo was watching with the unfocused attention of someone who'd heard 1,000 phone calls from the booking desk and found none of them interesting. But the 202 area code sat there. A detail so small it was invisible. A young man living in rural Mississippi, on disability benefits, working a part-time data entry contract, calling a DC number from memory during his one phone call from a Mississippi jail. Nobody asked about it. Nobody thought twice. 14 hours after his arrest, Josiah was released on his own recognizance. Misdemeanor criminal trespass. Court date set for 6 weeks out. May 21st, 2025, 9 a.m. Natchez Municipal Court. His crutch was returned at the front desk. The rubber tip had been scuffed. Something had dragged it across concrete, leaving gray marks on the black rubber. Intentional or careless, it didn't matter. The result was the same. A mobility device handled with the consideration normally given to a piece of surplus inventory. He walked home in the dark, 6 blocks, the crutch clicking on sidewalk. The night air thick with humidity and the sound of frogs from the river bottom and the distant hum of a refrigeration unit from the gas station on Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard. He didn't go to bed. He showered, changed clothes, made coffee. Then he opened his laptop, a refurbished ThinkPad, 3 years old, the kind of machine that looked unremarkable and ran exactly the software its owner needed it to run, and began compiling. Not writing, not journaling. Compiling. The word was specific. It described a process of taking scattered data, photographs, timestamps, voice memos, public records, schedules, correspondence, and organizing it into a structure that could be read, analyzed, and presented by someone whose job was to read, analyze, and present exactly this kind of information. The compilation took until 4 a.m. When it was done, Josiah had a file, encrypted, backed up to 2 separate cloud locations, organized by date and category, that documented every interaction, every violation, every fabricated form, every dump of debris, every assault, every delay, every lie. He closed the laptop, leaned back, looked at the ceiling of his mother's house, where a water stain shaped like the state of Tennessee had been spreading slowly since the roof leak she'd never had the money to fix. Then he set his alarm for 5:30 a.m. and went to sleep. He was at the park by 6. The morning after the arrest, the park was empty. No Kellaway, no patrol cars, no Overstreet watching from her porch. Just the birds and the river and the mist that clung to the grass like something that didn't want to let go. Josiah cleaned. Same routine, same sections, same trash bag filled with the same bottles and wrappers and cigarette butts that appeared daily no matter how many times he removed them. The Sisyphean nature of the work didn't discourage him. If anything, the repetition was the point. Maintenance wasn't a single act. It was a commitment repeated until the commitment itself became the message. By the second week after the arrest, the story had leaked beyond Natchez. Not through Josiah. He hadn't spoken to media, hadn't posted on social media, hadn't done any of the things that people in his situation were expected to do to raise awareness. The story leaked because Natchez was a small city, and small cities leaked the way old pipes leaked. Slowly, invisibly, until one day the water was everywhere and nobody could find the source. A reporter from the Natchez Democrat called. Josiah declined to comment. A regional affiliate out of Jackson left a voicemail. Josiah didn't return it. An online publication with justice in its name sent a message through the city's public comment portal. Josiah didn't respond. His silence was strategic. It was also suspicious, not in the way that guilt is suspicious, but in the way that training is suspicious. Ordinary people who got arrested for picking up trash in a park talked about it. They posted. They called the news. They wanted their story heard, because having their story heard was the only power they had. Josiah had something else, and his silence was the first clue, for anyone paying attention, that the something else was more valuable than publicity. Nadine Voss paid attention. She called on a Tuesday afternoon, 2 weeks and 3 days after the arrest. Her voice was professional, clipped, the voice of a woman with too many cases and not enough hours. Mr. Clemens, this is Nadine Voss. I'm an intake attorney with the ACLU of Mississippi, Jackson office. I've been made aware of your arrest on April 9th, and I'd like to discuss whether we can be of assistance. I appreciate the call. I've reviewed the publicly available records, the arrest report, the committee meeting minutes, the posted ordinance. I want to be upfront. We're understaffed and our docket is full, but your case has elements that may rise to the level of a civil rights violation. Specifically, the ADA issues during your arrest. The handcuffing. Correct. Failure to provide reasonable accommodation during a custodial encounter is well established under Title II. The denial of your crutch during booking is an additional violation. I'd like to file a preliminary complaint with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division on your behalf. A pause. The kind of pause that, to most people, would sound like hesitation. But Voss was trained to listen to pauses the way musicians were trained to listen to rests. The silence carried information. That won't be necessary, Josiah said, but I appreciate the offer. Another pause, this time hers. Mr. Clemens, can I ask, your FOIA request to the city was remarkably well drafted. Most pro-AC filings I see don't cite the specific exemption categories they're preemptively waiving. And the request was filed 3 days before your arrest, which suggests you anticipated the city's obstruction before it occurred. I read the statute carefully. I can see that. Voss's voice changed, not warmer, but more attentive. The way a professional recalibrates when they realize the person they're talking to is operating on a different level than initially assumed. Mr. Clemens, if there's anything you're not telling me about your situation, any additional resources or representation you already have in place, I'd appreciate knowing so I can allocate my time accordingly. I'm grateful for your call, Ms. Voss. I'll be in touch if I need assistance. She let it go, but she addressed him as Mr. Clemens for the rest of the call. Formal, careful, the way you speak to someone whose position you suspect but can't confirm. 3 days after Voss's call, Josiah received the FOIA response. Not the real one. The real one was still processing, apparently delayed by the 6 to 8 week timeline that Cora Linden had conjured from nothing. What Josiah received instead was a partial response, delivered by mail to his home address. 4 pages of documents, heavily redacted, with a cover letter explaining that certain records responsive to your request are exempt from disclosure under Mississippi Code Section 25-61-12, subsection 1, as they pertain to ongoing law enforcement investigation. There was no ongoing law enforcement investigation related to Bluff Park. The exemption was fabricated, applied to records that should have been freely available under the Public Records Act. But the 4 pages they did release were enough to start connecting the lines. Josiah laid them out on his kitchen table, read each one aloud, slowly, precisely, the way someone reads evidence into a record. Natchez PD dispatch log. Call ID number 2025-0417. Received April 9th, 2025, 6:02 a.m. Caller, Pamela Overstreet. Quote, "There is a man in Bluff Park again. He has been told to leave. He has a disability, and I am concerned for safety." End quote. Duration, 1 minute, 43 seconds. Dispatcher note, caller has placed 4 previous calls regarding same individual. No prior incidents documented. 5 calls.
0 incidents. The dispatcher had noted it. The pattern of repeated calls with no underlying event. The kind of pattern that, in law enforcement training materials, was identified as potential harassment by proxy. Second document. A partial email chain obtained through the FOIA despite Linen's best efforts to delay it. The headers were intact even though much of the body text had been redacted. Email dated April 3, 2025. From B-Jernigan at Natchez-M-S-.U-S. 2. Subject line, RE: Bluff Park timeline. Visible body text. Vantage South needs the community opposition cleared before the June council vote. The volunteer situation is becoming a PR problem. Can Kellaway handle it, or do we need to involve Delacroix? Jernigan, an alderman,
Writing to an unknown recipient about clearing community opposition to benefit a development company, mentioning Kellaway, a city employee, as a tool for handling a situation, mentioning Delacroix, a police captain, as an escalation option. Third document, a property record. Bluff Park, parcel number Adams-22-0-4-7. Current zoning, public green space. Pending rezoning application filed January 15, 2025, by Vantage South Development LLC. Applicant, Nolan Driscoll, CEO. The rezoning application had been submitted 4 months before Josiah started cleaning the park, and 3 months before the maintenance cuts that had allowed the park to deteriorate in the first place. The timeline was clear. The park wasn't neglected because of budget cuts. The park was neglected because neglect was the strategy. Let it rot, let it become unusable. Then rezone it, then sell it. Then build condos on 12 acres of Riverview land worth $14 million. And Josiah, with his crutch and his trash bags and his stubborn, visible daily presence, had become the obstacle. Not because he was powerful, because he was proof. Proof that the park was wanted. Proof that the community cared. Proof that the neglect was a choice, not a necessity. Fourth document, a partial copy of the Natchez PD body cam policy. Standard issue, all officers required to activate body-worn cameras at the beginning of any citizen encounter. Josiah cross-referenced the policy with the arrest timeline. Dispatch log showed Delacroix's unit arriving at Bluff Park at 6:14 a.m. on April 9th, but the body cam footage, referenced in the arrest report as see attached video file, had a start timestamp of 6:22 a.m. 8 minutes. 8 minutes between arrival and camera activation. 8 minutes of unrecorded interaction. The initial approach, the verbal exchange, the refusal to accommodate his disability, possibly the decision to arrest before any camera was running. 8 minutes that existed in the official record as a gap, not explained, not acknowledged, just missing. But the arrest report, written by Officer Dunn, badge number 2217, contained details that could only have been observed during those missing 8 minutes. The report stated that Josiah became verbally aggressive when informed of the trespass complaint. It stated that he refused multiple verbal commands to vacate the premises. It stated that he physically tensed his body in a manner consistent with pre-assault indicators. Verbally aggressive, the man who spoke in monotone, who cited statutes from printed copies, who said, "I heard you, and under what authority," and never once raised his voice. Pre-assault indicators, the man with cerebral palsy, whose right side moved in patterns he couldn't control, whose muscle tone fluctuated between spastic and flaccid, depending on fatigue and stress, whose body did things involuntarily that a trained officer, or an officer looking for an excuse, could interpret as aggression. The arrest report was a fiction A careful, documented, officially filed fiction that would sit in the system as fact unless someone pulled the body cam footage and placed it next to the written narrative and showed the gap between what was recorded and what was claimed. Someone would. That was the point of the 8 minutes. Not to hide the truth forever, just long enough for the official story to harden. Long enough for it to become the version that courts and committees and internal affairs reviews would use as their baseline. But the 8 minutes also meant something else. Someone had decided, before the camera was activated, that this encounter needed an unrecorded prologue. Decisions like that weren't made in the field by patrol officers. Decisions like that came from above. Josiah laid the 4 documents in a row on the kitchen table, photographed them, date-stamped, filed. Then he opened the encrypted file on his laptop and added a new section, a cross-reference matrix connecting names to actions to dates to code violations. Jernigan to Driscoll to Vantage South, Kellaway to Jernigan to the fabricated permit, Overstreet to the 911 calls to Delacroix to the arrest, Linden to the FOIA, delay to the missing documents. Each line was sourced. Each connection was documented. Each violation was mapped to a specific statute, not from memory, but from the legal research database he'd been accessing on the refurbished ThinkPad with the same methodical precision he'd applied to filling trash bags. He wasn't building a complaint. He wasn't building a lawsuit. He was building something larger, more comprehensive, more structurally threatening than any individual legal action. He was building a pattern. And patterns, once documented, once verified, once presented to the right authority with the right jurisdiction, were the one thing that powerful people couldn't deny, couldn't delay, couldn't make disappear. Not even in Mississippi. Not even in a town where the money owned the alderman, and the alderman owned the police, and the police owned the park. Or thought they did, until a 23-year-old man with a crutch and a camera, and a silence that nobody could explain, started picking up trash at 5:45 every morning and refused, no matter what they did to him, to stop. The community split. Pastor Boyce organized a prayer vigil at the park the Sunday after the arrest. 30 people came, mostly from the neighborhood south of the Bluffs, mostly black, mostly elderly, mostly the kind of people who remembered what the park used to be and mourned what it had become. They stood in a loose circle near the magnolia tree, and Boyce spoke about stewardship and public responsibility and the difference between ownership and care. Josiah stood at the edge of the circle, not at its center. He held his crutch and a trash bag, because even during a vigil, even during a gathering in his name, he'd arrived early and cleaned the section around the magnolia before anyone else showed up. The vigil was at 9 a.m. He'd been at the park since 5:45. Across the street, on the Bluff side, 15 residents stood with signs. White poster board, black marker, safety first, follow the rules, proper channels. The signs said nothing explicitly about Josiah, about race, about disability. They didn't need to. The message was in the geography, which side of the street you stood on, which direction you faced, whose version of order you were defending. Pamela Overstreet stood at the center of her group, wearing a white linen blazer and the particular expression of a woman who had confused her comfort with public safety. She didn't shout, didn't engage, just stood there, holding her sign, making sure the cameras saw her. The aggrieved citizen, the concerned neighbor, the victim of someone else's stubbornness. The confrontation that hadn't happened at the vigil happened afterward, in the parking lot, when Josiah was loading his trash bag into a borrowed pickup truck. A man Josiah hadn't seen before approached from the Bluff side of the street. Mid-50s, thick in the shoulders, wearing khaki shorts and a polo shirt with a country club logo. He walked directly to the truck, planted himself 3 feet from Josiah, and crossed his arms. "You're the one causing all this trouble." Not a question. Josiah tied the trash bag shut, set it in the truck bed. "I'm not causing anything. The property values on this street have dropped 6% since you started your little crusade. 6%. Do you know what that means? Do you have any idea what that costs people?" "Wow." The man's face was red, not from the heat, but from the kind of anger that lives close to the surface in people who measure their worth in appraisals. "I'm picking up trash in a public park." Josiah moved to the driver's side. The man stepped into his path. "You need to stop. You need to take whatever money that developer offered you and go somewhere else. This isn't your neighborhood. This isn't your fight. And frankly," he looked at the crutch with the expression of someone examining a damaged product, "you're not equipped for it." The word hung there. Equipped. A word that reduced a human body to a set of specifications and found it lacking. Josiah looked at him. The man was close enough that Josiah could smell the sunscreen and the bourbon that had been his breakfast. Close enough to touch. Close enough that if either of them moved wrong, proximity would become contact, and contact would become incident. "Step back, please." Josiah's voice didn't change, didn't rise, didn't add threat or plea. Just a flat request, the kind you make when you know your words are being stored somewhere. In a phone, in a memory, in a file that will be read by people with authority the man in the polo shirt doesn't know exists. The man didn't step back. He leaned closer. "Or what? You'll sue me? You'll call the ACLU? You'll cry disability and make the whole town feel guilty? I'll ask you again to step back. You're impeding my movement in a public space. I have a disability that affects my balance, and your proximity creates a safety risk." The formality confused him. The words were too precise, too calibrated, too much like a statement being read into a record rather than a conversation between two people in a parking lot. The man frowned, recalculated, and, because confusion is the enemy of aggression, stepped to the side. Josiah got in the truck, started the engine. The man stood in the parking lot, watching, his safety first sign tucked under his arm like a weapon he hadn't figured out how to use. The local news sent a camera crew. The segment ran that evening. Disabled man arrested for cleaning public park, community divided. The headline traveled. Regional outlets picked it up, then a national aggregator, then social media, where the story compressed into competing narratives: hero versus nuisance, rights versus rules, disability versus liability, each flattening the complexity into something that could be liked, shared, argued over, and forgotten. Josiah didn't watch the coverage, didn't read the comments, didn't engage, but Nolan Driscoll did. The call came at 7:45 p.m. on a Wednesday, Josiah's home phone, the landline his mother had never disconnected, and that still had the same number from when she'd installed it in 1993. "Mr. Clemens?" Driscoll's voice was different this time. The boardroom warmth was gone. What replaced it was the clipped efficiency of a man conducting a transaction. "I'll be direct. This situation has gotten more attention than anyone needs. I'm prepared to increase my offer. $25,000. You relocate. Find somewhere with better medical facilities, a city with resources appropriate to your condition." "My condition?" "Your disability, your financial situation, your living circumstances. I'm not being unkind. I'm being practical. Natchez doesn't have what you need. There are places that do. I can arrange a transition that works for everyone." Everyone meaning you. Everyone meaning the community. The park project will bring jobs, tax revenue, investment in infrastructure that this city hasn't seen in decades. One person's attachment to a patch of grass shouldn't stand in the way of that. "The park is public property, Mr. Driscoll. My attachment to it is irrelevant. The law is what's relevant. Laws change. Ordinances get passed. Zoning gets approved. It's how cities grow. And sometimes it's how cities steal from their own residents." The line went quiet. Not the quiet of consideration, the quiet of recalculation. Josiah could hear it. The shift from persuasion to assessment, from offer to threat, from the velvet to whatever came after the velvet. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." Josiah said it the way he said everything. Level, quiet, final. "The park is public property. I'll be there tomorrow morning." He hung up first. Then he sat in his mother's kitchen, in the house that smelled like her, that still had her curtains and her dishes and the water stain on the ceiling that grew a little bigger every time it rained, and he thought about what comes next. Not for him, for the file, for the pattern, for the documentation that had grown over 5 weeks from a folder of photographs into something comprehensive enough that the right office in the right city with the right authority could open it and see not an isolated incident, but a system, coordinated, deliberate, designed to take a public resource and convert it into private profit by weaponizing neglect, fabricating legal barriers, criminalizing the people who objected, and protecting the whole operation with the machinery of local government. He opened the encrypted file one more time, checked the cross-references, verified the statute numbers, confirmed the dates. Everything was there. Everything was documented. Everything was ready. The only question was timing. And timing, in this particular kind of work, was everything. He closed the laptop, set the alarm, went to sleep. Tomorrow morning, same as every morning. The crutch, the trash bag, the park that someone wanted to kill and someone else refused to let die. The next morning brought Kellaway back. Not in the truck this time. On foot. 7 a.m. Later than usual, after the joggers had started their routes, after the dog walkers had claimed their sections, after enough witnesses were present that whatever happened would happen in public. He found Josiah near the playground, working the area around the padlocked climbing structure. The orange out-of-service stickers had faded to pale sherbet in the sun, curling at the edges. City's filing a formal cease and desist. Kellaway held up a folded document, 2 pages, city letterhead, this time with a seal. You're ordered to discontinue all maintenance activities in Bluff Park, effective immediately. Josiah extended his left hand. Kellaway didn't give him the document. Instead, he dropped it. The pages fell to the grass at Josiah's feet. The small cruelty of making a man with a crutch bend down to retrieve something that could have been handed to him. Josiah looked at the pages on the grass, then at Kellaway. He didn't bend down. You can mail it to my home address, Josiah said. Service of a cease and desist requires delivery to the named individual's residence or by certified mail. Dropping a document on the ground in a public park doesn't constitute proper service under Mississippi Rules of Civil Procedure, Rule 4. Kellaway's face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds: surprise, frustration, and something that looked like the beginning of fear. Pick it up. It's your document. You dropped it. Kellaway stepped forward, close. Close enough that Josiah could see the veins in his neck, could smell the coffee and the industrial soap. Close enough that Josiah's right side, the side that didn't respond to threats the way his left side did, tightened involuntarily, the spastic reflex pulling his arm inward, curling his fingers, a response that his nervous system produced without asking his permission. I said, pick it up. A dog walker stopped on the path behind them. An elderly man with a golden retriever, standing very still, watching. Josiah didn't pick it up, didn't move, didn't flinch, just stood there with his crutch and his trash bag and the absolute, infuriating composure of someone who knew exactly what was happening and had already filed it. Kellaway bent down himself, snatched the pages, shoved them into Josiah's chest, hard enough to make him rock backward on the crutch, hard enough that the forearm cuff bit into his skin, hard enough that the dog walker took out his phone. Next time, Kellaway said, his voice low enough that only Josiah could hear. It won't be papers. He walked away. The dog walker approached. Sir, are you all right? Do you need me to? I'm fine, thank you. Josiah smoothed the crumpled pages against his thigh. Could I get your name and phone number, just in case? The man gave them. Howard Briggs, retired school teacher, lived on Rankin Street, walked his dog in the park every morning at 7. Another witness, another name, another entry in the folder that grew thicker every day. Josiah photographed the cease and desist, read it carefully. The document cited no specific ordinance, referenced general authority of the Parks Department to regulate activity in municipal spaces. Language so vague it would dissolve under the lightest legal scrutiny. It was signed by Kellaway himself, who had no authority to issue cease and desist orders. The Parks Department director's name was conspicuously absent. Another fabrication, another bluff dressed up as authority, another document that would sit in the evidence file alongside the fake permit, the unauthorized trespass sign, and the anonymous email. Each one a brick in the wall of a pattern that was becoming impossible to deny. And somewhere in a federal building on Pennsylvania Avenue, 1,200 miles north, in a city whose area code Josiah had dialed from a Mississippi booking desk, a voicemail sat unplayed on a phone that would be checked in the morning by someone whose job title included the words Civil Rights Division. 12 words, waiting. If this story is making you feel something, it should, because what Josiah has been building in silence is about to detonate in public, and nobody in Natchez is ready for what comes next. Subscribe now. Part 2 drops soon. But before any of that, before the courtroom, before the letters on federal letterhead, before the names and the numbers and the reckoning, there was one more morning at the park, 5:45 a.m. April 23, 2025. Josiah arrived to find the bench overturned, the one by the magnolia tree, the one where the water bottles appeared. Someone had flipped it, not the wind, not an accident, but deliberately, the bolts that secured it to the concrete pad sheared clean, the seat face down in the dirt. Next to the overturned bench, scratched into the wood with a key or a knife, 3 words, "Go home, cripple." Josiah stared at it for a long time, longer than he'd stared at anything since his mother's hospital bed. Then he took out his phone, photographed it, date-stamped, filed. Then he righted the bench, alone, using the crutch as a lever and his left arm and the stubborn architecture of a body that had never once worked the way it was supposed to and had never once stopped working entirely. It took him 7 minutes. When it was done, he sat on it, the same bench, the scratched words facing the ground now, pressed into the dirt where they belonged. He opened a new trash bag, and he started cleaning. Part 2. The voicemail was retrieved at 7:42 a.m. Eastern Standard Time on April 24, 2025, by a woman who had been waiting for it longer than Josiah knew. Camille Thornton had spent 14 years with the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division, senior trial attorney. The title sounded impressive and was, in practice, a description of how many hours per week a person could sustain the particular kind of exhaustion that came from fighting systems designed to outlast the people who challenged them. She had a caseload that would have been unreasonable for 3 attorneys. She managed it alone because funding didn't match mandate and because the alternative, dropping cases, closing files, telling communities that their civil rights would have to wait, wasn't something she could make herself do. She listened to the voicemail once, then again. 12 words, flat tone, no panic, no desperation. The voice of someone reporting a status change, not requesting rescue. She pulled up the file. Case number CRT-2025-MS-041. Preliminary assessment. Adams County and City of Natchez. Opened January 15th. Assigned specialist, Josiah Clemens, Community Relations Service. The file was thick. 6 weeks of daily reports, uploaded to the secure server from an encrypted laptop in a shotgun house in Mississippi. Photographs, timestamps, cross-reference matrices, copies of fabricated permits, unauthorized trespass notices, city emails obtained through public records requests, dispatch logs, body cam policy documents, property records, LLC filings. Each entry sourced, each connection mapped, each violation linked to a specific statute with the citation formatted the way DOJ training manuals taught their specialists to format them. Thornton had reviewed assessments from 43 cities in her career. She had never received one this comprehensive from a solo specialist operating without local support. She picked up the phone and dialed the number Josiah had called from, the main line at the Natchez Police Department booking desk, not to speak to Josiah, to establish a record, to put the department on notice that a federal employee had been arrested during the performance of official duties and that the Department of Justice was now paying very specific attention. The desk sergeant who answered, Trujillo, the same one who'd pressed Josiah's fingers into the ink pad, transferred the call 3 times before it landed on Captain Delacroix's desk. Delacroix didn't answer. The call went to voicemail. Thornton left a message of her own. 47 words, crisp, delivered in the particular cadence of federal authority that communicated, without stating explicitly, that the conversation had just moved to a level where local jurisdiction became a courtesy rather than a shield. Then she booked a flight to Jackson, rented a car, and drove 90 miles southwest to Natchez. She arrived on April 28th. She did not announce her arrival to the city. She did not contact the mayor's office or the police department or the alderman. She checked into the Natchez Grand Hotel on Broadway Street, ordered room service, and spent the evening reviewing every document in the file, cross-referencing Josiah's evidence with the DOJ's own databases, property records, campaign finance disclosures, corporate filings with the Mississippi Secretary of State. What she found confirmed what Josiah's documentation suggested and added dimensions he hadn't had access to. Vantage South Development, LLC, had been incorporated in January 2023. Members listed Nolan Driscoll, 60%, Kellaway Holdings, Inc., a shell entity registered to an address that matched Trent Kellaway's home, 15%, and Boyd W. Jernigan, 25%. An alderman, sitting on the Parks and Recreation Committee, chairing that committee, voting on ordinances that directly affected a park that his own company planned to develop, and never once filing the conflict of interest disclosure required by Mississippi Code Section 25-4-105. Thornton printed the LLC filing, laid it next to the email Josiah had obtained through FOIA, the one where Jernigan wrote about clearing community opposition before the June council vote, laid them both next to the timeline of park maintenance cuts that had begun 3 months after the LLC was formed. The pattern wasn't subtle, it was a blueprint. Neglect the park, create conditions for redevelopment, fabricate legal barriers against anyone who objected, use police power to enforce the fabrication, protect the investment with the machinery of government that was supposed to serve the public, not the shareholders of a private LLC. And in the middle of all of it, a 23-year-old man with cerebral palsy and a forearm crutch, picking up trash because someone had to, documenting everything because he'd been trained to, and waiting, with the patience that defined both his disability and his profession, for the moment when the file was thick enough and the pattern was clear enough and the authority was ready to act. That moment had arrived. But it hadn't arrived easily, and the 3 weeks between the voicemail and the courtroom were not quiet. The morning after Thornton retrieved the message, Josiah went back to the park. Same time, same routine. The trespass charge was pending, the court date was set, and any rational person, any person operating without the backing of a federal agency, without the knowledge that the charge would be dismissed before it ever reached trial, would have stayed home. Josiah wasn't operating without backing, but the people of Natchez didn't know that, and his continued presence in the park, day after day, arrest record attached to his name, misdemeanor charge on the docket, communicated something the documentation couldn't, that he believed what he was doing was right, and that belief didn't require permission. The resistance noticed. Overstreet escalated. She arrived at the park on a Wednesday morning, the first time she'd come in person rather than operating through phone calls and petitions and the comfortable distance of delegated aggression. She wore walking clothes and carried a bottle of water, and the expression of a woman who was performing leisure while conducting surveillance. She chose the bench near the playground, 50 yards from where Josiah was working, close enough to watch, far enough to claim coincidence. For 20 minutes she sat. Then she stood, walked to where Josiah was bending to pick up a plastic bag tangled in the roots of an oak, and stopped directly in his path. "Mr. Clemens!" Her voice carried the crispness of rehearsal. "I want you to know that I bear you no ill will." Josiah straightened. The crutch clicked against the root. "I'm simply concerned about the precedent. If anyone can come into a public space and decide to change it, without authorization, without oversight, without accountability, where does that end?" "I'm picking up litter, Ms. Overstreet." "You're making a statement, and statements have consequences." She stepped closer. Her perfume, something floral, expensive, the olfactory equivalent of the colonial on the bluffs, preceded her. "My family has lived on this street for 4 generations. We've invested in this community. We've paid taxes that maintain these spaces, and I will not apologize for wanting them managed properly." "Managed by whom?" "By the people who are qualified, who are authorized, who have the resources and the—" She paused, and the pause was the moment where the word she wanted to say fought with the word she'd been advised to say. The capability. Capability, a synonym for equipped, the same implication, wrapped in a different package. "I'm capable of picking up trash." Josiah's voice didn't change. "I've been doing it for weeks. The park is cleaner than it's been in 6 months." "That's not the point." "Then what is the point?" Overstreet's composure flickered. Underneath the linen and the perfume and the 4-generation pedigree, there was something raw. The frustration of a person who had always controlled the narrative in her neighborhood and was discovering that control required cooperation, and cooperation was something Josiah was not providing. "The point," she said, leaning forward until her face was 18 inches from his, "is that this park has a future that doesn't include you. And the sooner you understand that, the easier this will be. For everyone." She turned, walked back to the bench, collected her water bottle, left through the path that led to the bluffs, her walking shoes crunching gravel in a rhythm that sounded like retreat disguised as departure. Josiah photographed the bench where she'd sat, noted the time, filed. 4 days later, the second physical confrontation. Not Kellaway this time. Kellaway had been keeping his distance since the joggers witnessed the shove. But distance didn't mean absence. He'd sent a proxy. A man Josiah didn't recognize appeared at the park at 6 a.m. on a Saturday. Younger than Kellaway, mid-20s, built like someone who spent time in a gym rather than on a work crew. No uniform, no city ID visible. Just jeans, a black t-shirt, and the particular posture of someone who had been pointed in a direction and told to make a problem go away. He walked directly to where Josiah was working near the river overlook, the section with the best view, the section that would become the centerpiece of Driscoll's condo development, the section where Josiah's daily presence was most visible to the Bluffs residents who looked down from their porches. "Hey." No name, no introduction, just the monosyllable of someone who considered conversation a waste of the time allocated for intimidation. "You need to stop coming here." Josiah kept working, didn't look up. "I'm talking to you." "I hear you." "Then listen, people are getting tired of this. You got arrested once. You want to get arrested again?" Josiah straightened, looked at the man, took in the details, the unmarked clothes, the gym build, the absence of any identifying information. "Who sent you?" "Nobody sent me. You're at a public park at 6 a.m. on a Saturday to tell a stranger to stop picking up trash. Someone sent you." The man stepped into Josiah's space, close enough that Josiah could feel the heat off his body, smell the cheap body spray, See the small scar on his left eyebrow that suggested a history with situations exactly like this one. I'm giving you friendly advice. Take it or don't. But if you're here next Saturday, we're going to have a different conversation. Is that a threat? The man smiled, the kind of smile that was also an answer. Then he reached out, fast, casual, the motion of someone swatting a fly, and knocked the trash bag from Josiah's hand. The bag hit the ground. Trash spilled across the grass Josiah had just cleaned. Bottles, wrappers, a coffee cup, a diaper, all of it scattering in the morning breeze. "Oops," the man said. He didn't break eye contact. Josiah looked at the spilled trash, at the man, at the empty path behind him. 6 a.m. on a Saturday, no joggers, no dog walkers, no witnesses. Almost no witnesses. What the man didn't see, what he couldn't see from his angle, was the camera on Josiah's phone, propped against the base of the overlook railing where Josiah had placed it 20 minutes earlier, lens facing the section where he was working, a habit he'd developed after the Kellaway shove. Position the phone, frame the area, let it record. "You should go," Josiah said quietly, "before you do something that ends up in a federal evidence file." The word federal hit differently than anything else Josiah had said, not because the man understood what it meant, but because he didn't, and the not understanding created uncertainty, and uncertainty was the one thing bullies couldn't metabolize. He left. No second swing, no parting threat. Just the fast walk of someone who'd been given a job and wasn't sure he'd done it correctly. Josiah picked up the trash, refilled the bag, retrieved his phone, checked the recording. Clear, steady, the man's face visible for 11 seconds, the bag knock captured in full. Filed. Time-stamped. Added to the folder. The pretrial conference for Josiah's trespass charge was scheduled for May 14th, 2025, at 9 a.m. in Natchez Municipal Court. 3 weeks before the full trial date. Standard procedure: the judge would review the charge, hear preliminary motions, set ground rules for trial. Josiah's court-appointed attorney was named Dale Whitaker. 61 years old, semi-retired, handled misdemeanors and traffic violations and the occasional DUI, the kind of cases that required showing up more than they required preparation. He'd reviewed Josiah's arrest report, noted the trespass charge, and concluded, reasonably based on the information he had, that the case would likely be resolved with a fine and a warning to stay out of the park. He didn't know about the file, didn't know about the voicemail, didn't know about the woman who had driven 90 miles from Jackson with a briefcase full of federal authority and a letter signed by the Assistant Attorney General of the United States. Whitaker arrived at the courtroom at 8:47 a.m., coffee in hand, expecting a 15-minute proceeding. Josiah was already seated in the gallery. He'd arrived at 8:15. He wore the same jacket he always wore, the worn canvas coat that Kellaway and Delacroix and Overstreet had all seen, and all dismissed as the wardrobe of a man with no resources and no power and no reason to be taken seriously. At 8:53 a.m., the courtroom door opened. A woman entered. Black, mid-40s, wearing a charcoal suit that fit the way suits fit when they were tailored rather than purchased off a rack. She carried a leather briefcase and a banker's box. Her heels were low, practical, not decorative. Her hair was pulled back. Her expression was the particular neutral of someone who had walked into hostile courtrooms many times and had learned that the first weapon was composure. She walked directly to the defense table, set the banker's box on the surface, opened the briefcase, pulled out a single document, heavy bond paper, embossed seal, the kind of paper that came from offices where paper quality communicated institutional weight. Whitaker looked at her, then at Josiah, then back at her. "Can I help you?" "Mr. Whitaker, I'm Camille Thornton, Senior Trial Attorney, Civil Rights Division, United States Department of Justice." She extended her hand. Whitaker took it, the handshake of a man who had just realized that the 15-minute proceeding he'd anticipated was no longer in the category of things he was equipped to handle. "I'll be entering an appearance on behalf of Mr. Clemens. I filed a substitution of counsel with the clerk's office this morning." Whitaker looked at Josiah again. Josiah met his eyes, nodded once. The nod carried no apology and no explanation, just confirmation that this had been the plan, or something close to it, and that the man Whitaker had been representing was not entirely the man Whitaker had assumed he was representing. All right." Whitaker gathered his folder, stood, looked once more at the banker's box, which was large enough to hold several hundred pages of documents. "Good luck." He left. The courtroom was now occupied by Josiah, Thornton, the court reporter, 2 bailiffs, and, in the gallery, a scattering of people who had come for other cases on the morning docket. At 9 a.m., Judge Harold Pickens entered, 64 years old, Adams County native, 22 years on the municipal bench, the kind of judge who ran his courtroom with efficiency and mild irritation, who had seen everything and was surprised by nothing, and who valued his lunch break with a devotion that bordered on religious. Case number MC-20-20-5-0-7-2-9, the clerk announced. City of Natchez versus Josiah Clemens. Charge, criminal trespass, Mississippi Code Section 97-17-87. Thornton stood. Your Honor, Camille Thornton, entering appearance on behalf of the defendant. I filed a substitution of counsel and a motion to dismiss, copies of which have been provided to the prosecution and the court. The prosecutor, an assistant city attorney named Grady Ducey, who handled misdemeanor cases with the enthusiasm of a man filling out insurance forms, looked up from his file. He hadn't expected a DOJ attorney. He hadn't expected a motion to dismiss. He'd expected a guilty plea or a bench trial that would take 20 minutes. On what grounds? Judge Pickens adjusted his glasses. Your Honor, the trespass charge against Mr. Clemens is predicated on a trespass notice posted at Bluff Park on or about April 8, 2025. Thornton opened the banker's box and produced the first exhibit, a photograph of the laminated sign Kellaway had zip-tied to the park entrance. This notice was not authorized by any resolution of the Natchez Board of Aldermen. It was not approved by the Parks Department Director. It carries no city seal, no ordinance reference, no date of enactment, and no signature of an authorized municipal agent. She set the photograph on the bench. Mississippi Code Section 97-17-87 requires that a trespass warning be issued by the owner of the property or a duly authorized agent. For public property, authorization must derive from the governing body, in this case, the Board of Aldermen, through formal action. No such action was taken. The sign was posted by Trent Kellaway, Parks Maintenance Chief, acting without authorization, in furtherance of a purpose unrelated to legitimate park management. Doucet stood. Your Honor, the city maintains that the Parks Maintenance Chief has implied authority to. Implied authority is insufficient under Section 97-17-87. Thornton didn't raise her voice, didn't interrupt, simply continued over Doucet's objection with the smooth authority of someone who had made this argument before and knew exactly where it led. The Mississippi Court of Appeals addressed this directly in State v. Hendricks, 2017. Implied authority does not extend to restricting public access to public property, absent formal delegation by the governing body. No such delegation exists. The charge has no legal basis. Judge Pickens read the motion, read the photograph caption, looked at Doucet. Mr. Doucet, does the city have documentation of formal authorization for this trespass notice? Doucet opened his file, closed it, opened it again. Your Honor, I'd need to verify with the Parks Department. That's a no. Pickens removed his glasses, cleaned them on his robe, put them back on. Ms. Thornton, your motion to dismiss is granted. The charge of criminal trespass against Mr. Clemens is dismissed with prejudice. With prejudice, meaning it couldn't be refiled, meaning the charge was dead, not suspended, not reduced, not plea bargained into a fine, dead. Doucet sat down with the expression of a man who had just watched his afternoon free up and wasn't sure whether to be relieved or alarmed. Thornton wasn't finished. Your Honor, if I may address a related matter. Pickens looked at the clock, 9:11 a.m. His calendar was full, but the words Department of Justice had a gravitational pull that rearranged schedules. Go ahead. Thornton produced the second document from the banker's box, heavy bond paper, embossed seal, the letterhead of the United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division. Your Honor, I'm entering into the record a formal notification that the Department of Justice has opened a preliminary investigation into the city of Natchez, pursuant to 34 U.S.C. Section 12601, the Pattern or Practice Statute. This investigation concerns potential systemic violations of civil rights in the areas of public accommodation, law enforcement conduct, disability access, and municipal governance. The courtroom went very still. Additionally, I am authorized to disclose that Mr. Josiah Clemens is a specialist with the DOJ's Community Relations Service, assigned to conduct community-level assessment of civil rights practices in Natchez, Mississippi, since March 1, 2025. She laid the letter on the bench. Then she read it, aloud, the way receipts are read, the way evidence enters the record, the way truth replaces assumption. United States Department of Justice, Civil Rights Division, dated March 1, 2025. RE, Preliminary Assessment, Adams County and City of Natchez Municipal Practices. This letter confirms that Josiah Clemens, CRS Specialist ID number redacted, has been assigned to conduct community-level assessment of public accommodation, law enforcement interactions, and ADA compliance within the City of Natchez. Mr. Clemens's observations, documentation, and interactions during this period constitute official federal activity protected under 18 U.S.C. Section 111 and 18 U.S.C. Section 1114. Any interference with, intimidation of, or retaliation against Mr. Clemens in connection with these duties may constitute a federal offense. Signed, the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights. Doucette's pen had stopped moving. The court reporter's fingers had stopped typing. One of the bailiffs, the younger one, standing near the gallery door, shifted his weight and looked at the floor. In the gallery, Josiah sat in the same seat he'd occupied since 8:15. Same jacket, same crutch propped against the bench beside him. Same expression. The quiet, composed, faintly patient expression he'd worn while Kellaway dumped trash in his path, while Delacroix handcuffed him, while Trujillo pressed his fingers into ink, while Driscoll offered money and condescension, and the particular cruelty of suggesting that a man with a disability should know his place. He'd been a federal employee the entire time. Every morning at the park, documented. Every confrontation with Kellaway, documented. Every phone call from Overstreet to dispatch, documented. Every fabricated form, every delayed FOIA response, every shove and threat and small humiliation, all of it fed into a file that now sat in a banker's box on a municipal court bench, and that file was about to be read by people with the authority to act on it. Judge Pickens read the letter twice. Then he looked at Thornton over his glasses with an expression that was equal parts respect and wariness, the look of a judge who understood that the case in front of him had just expanded beyond his courtroom. Ms. Thornton, this notification will be entered into the record. Is there anything else for this court? No, Your Honor. The federal investigation will proceed through the Civil Rights Division. We will be in contact with the appropriate municipal officials. Very well. Pickens banged his gavel once. Case dismissed. Court will take a 10-minute recess. The recess lasted 45 minutes. Not because Pickens needed the time, because word traveled fast in a building where the police department, the city attorney's office, and the alderman's chambers all shared the same structure. By 9:30, 3 phone calls had been made from the courthouse to the mayor's office. By 9:45, the mayor had called the city attorney. By 10, the city attorney had called the assistant city attorney, Doucette, and asked him to repeat, slowly, exactly what had happened in courtroom B. By 10:30, the mayor's office had issued a statement. The city of Natchez has been made aware of a federal inquiry and is cooperating fully. They were not cooperating fully. They were panicking quietly, which in government looked exactly like cooperation until you read the emails. Thornton didn't go to the mayor's office, didn't contact the police department, didn't make courtesy calls or arrange introductory meetings or do any of the diplomatic choreography that federal attorneys sometimes performed when entering local jurisdictions. She went back to the hotel, opened her laptop, and began drafting the formal notification letters that would arrive, by certified mail, by courier, and by hand delivery, at 9 separate addresses over the next 72 hours. Nolan Driscoll received his notification at his office in Jackson, a glass-fronted suite in a building that had his name on the lease. The letter informed him that Vantage South Development, LLC, was a subject of interest in a DOJ investigation, that all documents related to the Bluff Park development project should be preserved, and that failure to comply with preservation requirements could constitute obstruction under 18 U.S.C. Section 1519. Driscoll read it twice. Then he called his attorney. Then his attorney called a criminal defense specialist. Then the criminal defense specialist called a colleague who had experience with DOJ pattern or practice investigations. The chain of legal panic extended outward like ripples from a stone dropped in still water. Alderman Boyd Jernigan received his at City Hall. The letter specifically referenced his LLC membership in Vantage South and his failure to file a conflict of interest disclosure as required by Mississippi Code Section 25-4-105. It also referenced his email, the one about clearing community opposition, which was now federal evidence. Jernigan read it in his office with the door closed. His hands, according to his secretary who brought him coffee 10 minutes later, were shaking. Captain Russ Delacroix received his at the police station. The letter detailed the body cam gap, the ADA violations during the arrest, and the discrepancies between Officer Dunn's written report and the recorded portion of the encounter. It noted that the arrest of a federal employee during the performance of official duties raised potential violations of 18 U.S. See Section 111, assault or interference with a federal officer. Delacroix read it, folded it, put it in his desk drawer. Then he called the police union attorney, who told him to say nothing, write nothing, and, most importantly, to not, under any circumstances, contact Josiah Clemens. Cora Linden received hers at the clerk's office. The letter referenced her delay of Josiah's FOIA request beyond the statutory timeline, her creation of a fabricated permit form, and her potential role in coordinating the obstruction of public records access. It was the shortest letter of the 9. It needed to be. The facts were simple, and the violation was clear. Linden read it, excused herself from the office, went to the bathroom, and didn't come out for 20 minutes. Pamela Overstreet received hers at home, delivered by courier to the Colonial on the Bluffs. The letter informed her that her 5911 calls regarding Josiah Clemens were under review for potential violation of Mississippi Code, Section 97-9-125, filing false reports. It noted that the pattern of calls, 5 reports, 0 incidents, each identifying the subject's disability, raised additional concerns under federal disability discrimination statutes. Overstreet called Jernigan. Jernigan didn't answer. She called Delacroix. Delacroix's voicemail was full. She called Driscoll. Driscoll's attorney answered and told her that Mr. Driscoll was not available and that she should retain her own legal counsel immediately. The network fractured along the lines that power always fractures along: self-interest, each node protecting itself first. The coordination that had been so seamless, alderman to police captain to maintenance chief to city clerk, each performing its role in the machinery of exclusion, dissolved overnight. Not because the people in it had become honest, but because they had become afraid. And fear, unlike loyalty, was not a team sport. Driscoll made one more attempt. Not through lawyers, not through proxies. He came in person. 3 days after the notification letters, a Wednesday evening, Josiah was on his porch when the black Escalade pulled onto his street. Same vehicle, same tinted windows, same driver staying in the car, but Driscoll got out differently this time. No envelope. No check, no smile. He walked up the broken sidewalk to the porch steps and stopped at the bottom, looking up at Josiah the way a man looks at a piece of equipment that has malfunctioned in a way he didn't think was possible. "You could have told me." Driscoll's voice was flat. No warmth, no threat, just the exhausted neutrality of a man who had spent 3 days with attorneys and had run out of strategies. "That first morning, when I offered the check, you could have told me who you were." "I'm not required to identify myself as a federal employee during a preliminary assessment. You know that. Your attorneys have told you that by now." "My attorneys have told me a lot of things." Driscoll put his hands in his pockets. The gesture made him look smaller. The suit still expensive, the posture still erect, but something underneath it hollowed out. "They've told me the development is probably dead. Not frozen, dead. The federal monitor alone adds 18 months of review before any rezoning can proceed. By then, the political landscape changes, the financing terms expire, and the whole project collapses under its own weight. I'm sorry about the project." Josiah said it without sarcasm, without satisfaction, with the genuine regret of someone who understood that economic development mattered and that the people who would benefit from jobs and investment were not the same people who had orchestrated the corruption. "But you built it on a foundation that included an elected official who voted on ordinances benefiting his own company. The project was compromised before I ever picked up a trash bag." "I know." Driscoll looked at the porch, at the peeling paint, at the garden his mother had planted. "That's the part I can't figure out. Jernigan approached me, said he could guarantee the rezoning, said the park was already being phased out of the maintenance budget. I should have asked more questions, should have wondered why an alderman was so eager to partner on a project in his own district. But you didn't ask." "No, I didn't ask." He paused, looked at the house one more time. "I've been in this business for 30 years. I've built shopping centers and medical complexes and residential towers in cities across the South. I've never had a federal investigation. I've never had a DOJ letter. And I've never been outsmarted by a kid with a—" He stopped, caught himself on the edge of the word. The same edge Overstreet had caught herself on, the same edge that every person in this story had approached and most had fallen over. "By a specialist," Driscoll said instead, "who was smarter than everyone in the room, including me." He walked back to the Escalade. The door closed. The engine started. The tires rolled over the cracked concrete, and the vehicle disappeared around the corner the same way it had the first time, with the quiet authority of expensive machinery retreating from a fight it had lost. Josiah sat on the porch. The evening air was thick with humidity and honeysuckle and the sound of a television from the neighbor's house playing a game show where people won prizes for answering questions correctly. He didn't feel victorious. He felt tired. The particular tiredness that came not from physical labor. His body was used to physical labor, had negotiated with physical labor every day of its existence, but from the emotional weight of being underestimated as a strategy, of letting people look at his crutch and his skin and his house and his poverty and conclude that these things defined the limits of his capability, of absorbing their contempt because the absorption was the work, and the work required endurance more than it required strength. He finished the coffee. Watched the fireflies begin their nightly display. The small lights blinking in the darkness, signaling things only other fireflies understood. Trent Kellaway received his notification last, not at the Parks Department, at his home, because Kellaway had called in sick the morning after the courtroom proceedings and had not returned to work since. His letter detailed the unauthorized trespass notice, the debris dumping, the physical assault witnessed by 2 joggers, the fabricated permit requirement, and the cease and desist order he'd issued without authority. His attorney, a personal injury lawyer who normally handled fender benders, read the letter and told Kellaway he was out of his depth. Kellaway needed a criminal defense attorney. Kellaway said he couldn't afford one. His attorney said that was a problem. Kellaway went on medical leave. The official reason was stress-related illness. The unofficial reason was that standing in a courtroom or a deposition room and answering questions about why he'd shoved a disabled federal employee in a public park was not something his attorney recommended he do without significantly more expensive legal representation. The City Council emergency session was convened on May 21st, exactly 4 weeks after the courtroom proceedings, exactly the amount of time it took for the mayor's office to transition from panic to strategy. Mayor Rosalind Cartier, 56, in her second term, a moderate who had built her political career on economic development and infrastructure and the particular skill of appearing to support everyone while committing to no one, presided from the center of the council platform. She wore a navy blazer and the expression of a woman who had spent 4 weeks being advised by attorneys and had not enjoyed a single minute of it. The chamber was full. Residents from both sides of the street, the Bluffs and the South Side, filled the gallery seats and stood along the walls. Local media occupied the back row. A crew from a Jackson television station had set up a camera in the corner. Pastor Boyce sat in the front row of the gallery with members of Mount Olive Baptist. Councilwoman Alma Gaines sat at the council table, and if her expression contained a note of vindication, the sole dissenting vote, now validated, she kept it professional. Josiah was not in the chamber. He was across the hall, in a conference room the mayor's office had designated for federal observers, watching through a closed-circuit feed that had been installed for overflow viewing. He was alone except for Thornton, who sat beside him with a legal pad and a pen, and the particular calm of someone who had done this exact thing. Entered a hostile jurisdiction, presented evidence, and waited for the system to decide how much accountability it was willing to tolerate, more times than she wanted to count. The session opened with the mayor's statement, carefully written, carefully delivered. The words cooperation, transparency, and commitment to community appeared 4 times each. The word wrongdoing appeared 0 times. Then Thornton was invited to present. She entered the chamber through the side door, the way witnesses and presenters entered, not through the public gallery. She carried the banker's box. She set it on the presentation table. She adjusted the microphone. Mayor Cartier, members of the council, my name is Camille Thornton. I'm a senior trial attorney with the Civil Rights Division of the United States Department of Justice. I am here today to present the preliminary findings of a pattern or practice assessment conducted pursuant to 34 U.S.C. Section 12601. No speeches, no rhetoric, no appeals to emotion. Just the facts, delivered in the order they occurred, supported by documents that she placed on the table one at a time, the way bricks are laid, each one supporting the one above it, each one making the structure harder to deny. First, the maintenance records. 4 months of deliberately reduced service to Bluff Park. Mowing canceled, trash pickup reduced, playground equipment decommissioned, each cut approved by the Parks Department under the signature of Trent Kellaway, each cut coinciding with the timeline of Vantage South's rezoning application. Second, the LLC filing, pulled up on the screen, Mississippi Secretary of State, Business Filing Number 2023-14789. Entity, Vantage South Development, LLC. Members, Nolan Driscoll, 60%. Kellaway Holdings, Inc., 15%. Boyd W. Jernigan, 25%. Alderman Jernigan holds a 25% ownership stake in the entity that stands to profit from the rezoning of Bluff Park. Thornton's voice didn't change inflection. He chaired the Parks and Recreation Committee that voted to restrict public access to the park. He voted on the ordinance that created the legal pretext for Mr. Clemens's arrest. And he never filed a conflict of interest disclosure as required by Mississippi Code Section 25-4-105. Jernigan's attorney, a thin man in an expensive suit who had arrived 15 minutes before the session, leaned toward the microphone at Jernigan's seat. My client's investment in Vantage South is a passive financial interest and does not— Alderman Jernigan, Thornton continued, and she produced the email, the one from the FOIA response, the one Josiah had read aloud in his kitchen and filed in the encrypted folder. Your email dated April 3rd states, and I quote from the subject visible in the FOIA released headers, Vantage South needs the community opposition cleared before the June council vote. The volunteer situation is becoming a PR problem. Can Kellaway handle it, or do we need to involve Delacroix? End quote. The chamber went silent, not the polite silence of a meeting, the silence of people hearing something they can't unhear. That is not a passive investment, Alderman. That is active participation in a coordinated effort to suppress community opposition to a development project in which you hold a direct financial stake. The use of a city employee, Kellaway, and law enforcement, Captain Delacroix, as instruments of that suppression raises concerns under 18 U.S.C. Section 242, deprivation of rights under color of law. Jernigan's attorney whispered something. Jernigan's face had gone the color of old paper. Not white, not flushed, but drained, the physiological response of a man watching his political career collapse in real time. Third, the 911 call pattern. 5 calls from Pamela Overstreet, each identifying Josiah's disability, each resulting in police response despite 0 documented incidents. A pattern of repeated false or misleading reports targeting a specific individual based on disability constitutes potential harassment under ADA, Title II, and potential filing of false reports under Mississippi Code, Section 97-9-125. Thornton laid the dispatch logs on the table. The DOJ is referring this matter to the Adams County District Attorney for review. Fourth, the body cam footage, or more precisely, the absence of it. Officer Dunn's body cam recorded the encounter beginning at 6:22 a.m. The dispatch log places unit arrival at 6:14 a.m. The arrest report authored by Officer Dunn describes events, verbal exchanges, behavioral observations, commands to vacate, that could only have occurred during the 8-minute window before recording began. Thornton placed the arrest report next to the dispatch log. Either the report is inaccurate, or the events it describes occurred off-camera by design. In either case, the discrepancy is a matter for the internal affairs investigation that the DOJ is recommending. She paused. Let the documents sit on the table. Let the council look at them. The filings, the emails, the logs, the reports, the pattern. Additionally, Mr. Clemens's arrest involved multiple ADA violations. He was handcuffed behind his back despite informing officers of his hemiplegia and requesting front cuffing as a reasonable accommodation. His mobility device was confiscated and not returned for approximately 4 hours. He was required to stand without the device during booking photographs. These failures are not ambiguous. They are direct violations of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, which applies to all state and local government activities, including law enforcement. Fifth, the fabricated legal instruments. The volunteer service permit that didn't exist until Josiah asked for it. The trespass sign with no authority behind it. The cease and desist that Kellaway signed without authorization. Each of these documents was created to provide a legal veneer for actions that had no legal basis. Each was designed to restrict a citizen's access to public property, and each was deployed against a black man with a disability who was performing a service the city itself had abandoned. The pattern is not incidental, it is coordinated. It involves elected officials, municipal employees, and law enforcement, and it is precisely the type of systemic conduct that Section 12,601 was enacted to address. Thornton closed the banker's box. The Department of Justice is formally requesting the appointment of a federal monitor to oversee Natchez municipal practices for a period of 12 months, with authority to audit law enforcement procedures, public access policies, disability accommodation protocols, and ethics compliance. We are further requesting that the Vantage South Development Agreement be suspended pending the completion of this investigation. She sat down. The chamber erupted. Not in applause, in noise. Murmurs, whispers, a few raised voices from the gallery. The Jackson TV crew adjusted their camera. Pastor Boyce sat very still in his front row seat, his hands folded in his lap, his expression suggesting he had just watched something he'd been waiting 61 years to see and was still deciding whether to believe it was real. Mayor Cartier called for order. It took 2 minutes to get it. Then the council voted. The vote on the development suspension was 4-2. Jernigan abstained. On his attorney's advice, the abstention itself, an admission that voting either way would have deepened his legal exposure. The Vantage South agreement was frozen. Not cancelled, frozen. The development could still proceed if the investigation cleared the project of civil rights concerns. But the June council vote Jernigan had written about in his email would not happen. The vote on the federal monitor was 5-1. Only Alderman Ray Dantley, a Jernigan ally who had been conspicuously silent during the presentation, voted against. The monitor would be appointed within 30 days, with authority to review and recommend changes to city policies, police procedures, and administrative processes. Then the individual outcomes. Jernigan, suspended from the Parks and Recreation Committee, effective immediately, pending a formal ethics review by the Mississippi Ethics Commission. His attorney filed a motion requesting a 4-month continuance before the hearing. The motion would be granted, not because it had merit, but because continuances were the language of institutional delay, and institutions spoke that language fluently. Delacroix, placed on administrative leave with pay, not fired, not charged, not disciplined. Administrative leave, the holding pattern that organizations used when they needed time to determine whether accountability would cost more than protection. The Natchez PD Internal Affairs Division, which consisted of 2 investigators, both of whom reported to the chief, who was Delacroix's golfing partner, would conduct the review. Kellaway, still on medical leave, no action taken. His attorney had submitted a letter stating that Kellaway was unable to participate in proceedings due to health reasons and requesting indefinite postponement of any administrative action. The letter was filed. The postponement was noted. Nothing happened. Linden, placed on administrative leave for FOIA processing failures. Her desk was cleared by noon. Her passwords were changed by 1 p.m. Whether the leave was punitive or protective depended on who was asking and what they wanted to hear. Overstreet, no city action. She wasn't a city employee. The referral to the DA for potential false report charges was exactly that, a referral. The DA, who was elected, who depended on votes from the Bluffs, who had never prosecuted a false report case involving a white resident calling police about a black man in a public space, would review the referral and, probably, decline to file charges, citing insufficient evidence of intent. The system was performing accountability the way it always performed accountability, partially reluctantly, with maximum protection for its own and minimum consequence for those who had wielded its power as a weapon. Outside the council chamber, the corridor was chaos. Reporters clustered around the exits. Residents argued in clusters. The geographic division of the vigil replicated indoors. South Side voices on one side of the hall, Bluff's residents on the other, the gap between them physical and permanent. Josiah left the conference room through the side exit. He made it 12 steps before someone blocked his path. A man, 50s, red-faced, wearing a golf shirt with the logo of a club Josiah had never been invited to enter. He stood in the corridor, with his arms crossed, and the expression of someone who had just watched his property values threatened by a federal investigation and had decided, in the particular logic of wounded privilege, that the person responsible was the one who had endured the most. "You happy now?" The man's voice was loud enough to echo off marble. "You just killed this town's biggest development deal. $14 million, jobs, investment, gone because you had to make yourself a victim." Josiah adjusted his crutch. "Excuse me. No, you don't get to walk away from this." The man stepped closer. Behind him, 2 others, same demographic, same outrage, same golf shirts, formed a loose semicircle, not quite surrounding, not quite threatening. The arrangement of men who wanted to intimidate without the inconvenience of being accused of it. "You came here and you stirred up problems that didn't exist. This park was fine. The city had a plan. And now we've got the federal government breathing down our necks because some—" He stopped himself. The word he almost said hung in the air between them, unspoken but as present as a smell. He coughed, redirected. "Because some outsider decided to play hero. I'm not an outsider. I live 6 blocks from the park." Josiah's voice remained level. The same level it had been during the arrest, during the booking, during every confrontation. Not because he didn't feel. He felt everything. Felt the corridor closing, felt the men's body heat, felt the particular vulnerability of being a man with a crutch surrounded by men who didn't need one. But because the feeling was secondary to the documentation, and the documentation was always running. You live in a house that's falling apart on a street the city should have condemned. Don't pretend you belong here. The second man, shorter, heavier, his neck flushed the color of raw ham, stepped in. My wife's business depends on that development. The restaurant traffic, the tourism. You just cost us everything. The development was suspended because an elected official has an undisclosed financial interest in the project. That's a conflict of interest under state law. I didn't create the conflict. I documented it. You documented it. The first man's voice dripped with the particular contempt reserved for people who use precise language in heated moments. Big words for a guy who picks up trash. Josiah looked at him, looked at all three of them, looked past them to the corridor where a security guard was watching from 50 feet away, hands on his belt, not moving. I'm going to leave now. Josiah said it calmly. If you prevent me from leaving, you'll be obstructing a person with a disability from exiting a public building, which is an ADA violation. And, he paused, the smallest pause, the kind that created space for what came next. There's a camera at the end of this hallway. It's been running since before you stopped me. All three men looked. The camera was there, a standard municipal security camera, bolted to the ceiling, its red recording light blinking steadily. The semicircle opened, not because they wanted it to, because the camera was watching, and the camera didn't care about golf shirts or property values, or the particular fury of men who had confused their investments with their identities. Josiah walked through the gap. His crutch clicked on marble. He didn't look back. At the end of the corridor, he stopped, steadied himself against the wall, not because his body needed it, because his hands were shaking and he didn't want anyone to see. The calm was real, and the calm was a performance, and both things were true simultaneously, and the cost of holding them together was something he paid every time he left a room full of people who wanted him gone. He breathed. Once, twice. The shaking stopped. Then he pushed through the exit and walked into the Mississippi sun. Josiah watched the council proceedings from the conference room across the hall. The closed-circuit feed was clear enough to see faces, but not clear enough to read expressions. He watched Thornton present the evidence he'd spent 6 weeks collecting, watched the council members shift in their seats, watched Jernigan's attorney whisper and Jernigan's face drain and the chamber fall silent when the email was read. He felt nothing dramatic, no triumph, no vindication. The words that people used for moments like these, justice, victory, accountability, were words that described outcomes, and the outcomes here were still unfolding. Jernigan was suspended, not removed. Delacroix was on leave, not fired. Kellaway was hidden behind medical paperwork. Driscoll was unnamed in the proceedings. His development frozen, but his company intact. His money still in the accounts that money like his always found its way into. What Josiah felt was something quieter and more complicated. He felt the particular exhaustion of a person who had done exactly what they were trained to do, had endured exactly what they expected to endure, and now had to reconcile the cost of the work with the incompleteness of the result. He turned off the monitor, picked up his crutch, left the conference room through the side exit. The corridor was chaos. Reporters clustered around the chamber doors. Residents argued in tight groups. The geographic division of the prayer vigil replicated indoors. South Side voices on one side of the hall, Bluff's residents on the other, the gap between them physical and permanent. Josiah made it 12 steps before someone blocked his path. A man, 50s, red-faced, wearing a golf shirt with the logo of a club Josiah had never been invited to enter. He stood in the corridor with his arms crossed and the expression of someone who had just watched his property values threatened by a federal investigation and had decided, in the particular logic of wounded privilege, that the person responsible was the one who had endured the most. You happy now? The man's voice was loud enough to echo off marble. You just killed this town's biggest development deal. $14 million, jobs, investment, gone, because you had to make yourself a victim. Josiah adjusted his crutch. Excuse me. No, you don't get to walk away from this. The man stepped closer. Behind him, 2 others, same demographic, same outrage, same golf shirts, formed a loose semicircle. Not quite surrounding, not quite threatening. The arrangement of men who wanted to intimidate without the inconvenience of being accused of it. You came here and you stirred up problems that didn't exist. This park was fine. The city had a plan. And now we've got the federal government breathing down our necks because He stopped himself. The word he almost said hung in the air between them, unspoken but as present as a smell. He coughed, redirected. Because some outsider decided to play hero. I'm not an outsider. I live 6 blocks from the park. Josiah's voice remained level. The same level it had been during the arrest, during the booking, during every confrontation. Not because he didn't feel, he felt everything, felt the corridor closing, felt the men's body heat, felt the particular vulnerability of being a man with a crutch surrounded by men who didn't need one, but because the feeling was secondary to the function, and the function was always the same: observe, document, endure. You live in a house that's falling apart on a street the city should have condemned. Don't pretend you belong here. The second man, shorter, heavier, his neck flushed the color of raw ham, stepped in. My wife's business depends on that development. The restaurant traffic, the tourism, you just cost us everything. The development was suspended because an elected official has an undisclosed financial interest in the project. That's a conflict of interest under state law. I didn't create the conflict. I documented it. You documented it. The first man's voice dripped with the particular contempt reserved for people who use precise language in heated moments. Big words for a guy who picks up trash. The third man, silent until now, the quiet enforcer of the trio, reached out and tapped Josiah's crutch with the toe of his loafer. Not hard, not enough to unbalance, just enough to say, I see your weakness. I know where you're vulnerable. A tap that was also a message. Josiah looked down at the crutch, looked at the man. The look lasted 3 seconds and communicated everything a verbal response would have, with the addition of the particular weight that silence carries when the silent person knows something the loud person doesn't. I'm going to leave now. Josiah said it calmly. There's a security camera at the end of this hallway. It's been running since before you stopped me. All three men looked. The camera was there, a standard municipal security camera, bolted to the ceiling, its red recording light blinking steadily. The semicircle opened, not because they wanted it to, because the camera was watching, and the camera didn't care about golf shirts or property values or the particular fury of men who had confused their investments with their identities. Josiah walked through the gap. His crutch clicked on marble. He didn't look back. At the end of the corridor, he stopped, steadied himself against the wall, not because his body needed it, because his hands were shaking, and he didn't want anyone to see. The calm was real, and the calm was a performance, and both things were true simultaneously, and the cost of holding them together was something he paid every time he left a room full of people who wanted him gone. He breathed. Once, twice. The shaking stopped. Then he pushed through the exit and walked into the Mississippi afternoon. He went home, made coffee, sat on his mother's porch. The river was there, the way it always was, moving south, taking everything with it and leaving the banks unchanged. 3 days after the council session, the park maintenance schedule was reinstated. Full service, weekly mowing, daily trash pickup, playground equipment inspection. A new crew arrived on Thursday morning, 2 workers in a Natchez Parks Department van, neither of them Kellaway. They mowed the entire 12 acres in 3 hours. They emptied every trash can. They removed the padlock from the climbing structure and peeled off the orange out-of-service stickers that had been there since January. Josiah was at the park when they arrived. Same time, same routine, same trash bag. The crew chief, a woman named Darla, mid-30s, who introduced herself with a handshake and a lack of eye contact that suggested she'd been briefed about who Josiah was and wasn't sure how to act around a person who had just rattled the entire city government, parked the van, and got out. Mr. Clemens? That's right. She looked at his trash bag, at the section he'd already cleaned, at the crutch. We're back on full schedule. Weekly maintenance, starting today. Good. You don't need to. We've got it covered now. Josiah tied off the trash bag. I know, but I'm going to keep cleaning anyway, if that's all right. Darla opened her mouth, closed it, nodded. He kept cleaning. The following week, a letter arrived at Josiah's house from the DOJ, Civil Rights Division, Personnel Office. He recognized the envelope, the weight of government paper, the particular shade of off-white that federal stationery used, the stamp of the department seal in the upper left corner. He didn't open it immediately, set it on the kitchen table next to his laptop and the coffee mug his mother had bought from a dollar store in Vidalia, Louisiana, the one that said "World's Best," with the rest of the text faded away, so only the superlative remained, unattached to any specific claim. He knew what the letter contained: reassignment, the next city, the next park or school district or housing authority or police department where someone needed a person with patient hands and a strong stomach and the willingness to be treated badly for months so that the treatment could be documented and the documentation could become the foundation for change that might make things slightly less bad for the people who came after. He opened the letter that evening, after the park, after the coffee, after the phone call he made to the 202 number. A debriefing call with his supervisor, routine, 10 minutes, mostly logistics. Reassignment, effective June 15th. Location, redacted pending clearance. Report date, June 22nd, 5 weeks. He had 5 more weeks in Natchez before the work moved him elsewhere, and the house went dark again, and the porch sat empty, and the park that had been neglected, reclaimed, weaponized, fought over, and finally maintained, would continue without him. That evening, Pastor Boyce came by. Not for church business, not for case business. Just to sit on the porch and eat the catfish he'd brought from a place on John R. Junkin Drive that had been frying fish since before either of them was born. They sat in silence for a while. The good kind, the kind that didn't need filling. Your mama would have been proud. Boyce said it the way he said most things. Gently, with the particular weight of a man who had buried more people than he'd baptized, and understood that the living needed the dead's approval more than the dead needed anything at all. She would have told me to keep cleaning. Josiah picked a bone from the catfish, set it on the paper plate. She would have been right. The silence came back, comfortable, full. The river sounds rising through it like a pulse. Josiah's phone rang, the 202 number. He looked at it, the screen glowing in the dusk light, and didn't answer. Set it on the porch railing. The ring stopped. Voicemail. He didn't check it, not yet. The catfish was still warm, and the evening was still good, and the man beside him was the closest thing to family he had left in the city, and some moments deserved to exist without the intrusion of whatever came next. Later. He'd check it later. 2 days later, a Friday, early morning. Josiah was at the park. A white cargo van pulled into the gravel lot. Natchez Parks Department logo on the side. New decal, bright green, freshly applied. A man got out. Young, late 20s, wearing the standard Parks polo. He looked at Josiah, looked at the trash bag. You Clemens? That's right. The man walked to the back of the van, opened the double doors. Inside, a riding mower, fresh bags of mulch, a case of heavy-duty trash bags, the same brand Josiah had been ordering online since the hardware store stopped stocking them. They told me to start full maintenance, mowing, trash, landscaping, the whole schedule. Weekly. He pulled out the box of trash bags and set it on the ground near the bench. Also told me to tell you something. Josiah waited. The man rubbed the back of his neck. Captain Delacroix filed his retirement papers yesterday, effective immediately. Full pension. The words landed the way words land when they confirm something you already knew, but hadn't yet heard said aloud. Josiah didn't turn around, didn't nod, didn't react in any visible way. He stood with his crutch and his trash bag, and the morning light turning the river gold, the same way it had every morning for 6 weeks, the same way it would every morning after he was gone. Delacroix had chosen the exit, not because he was forced, not because Internal Affairs had completed its review. The review was ongoing, would be ongoing for months, would probably conclude with insufficient evidence to sustain administrative charges, because the body cam gap had no explanation, and no explanation was, in the grammar of institutional self-protection, the same as no violation. He'd chosen to leave because leaving was cheaper than staying, because retirement with full pension was the system's way of resolving problems without admitting they existed, because accountability, in institutions that feared accountability more than they feared wrongdoing, looked like a quiet departure and a generous check. That was how the system worked. Not with justice, with exits. The park looked better. The mower hummed. The mulch smelled like cut pine and clean earth. The magnolia tree cast its shadow across the bench, the same bench that someone had overturned and scratched with 3 words that Josiah had pressed into the dirt where they belonged. The maintenance worker finished unloading, climbed on the mower, started cutting the first section. The sound filled the morning, mechanical, rhythmic, the sound of a city doing what it was supposed to do, finally, after 6 months of deliberate neglect and 6 weeks of concentrated cruelty. Josiah Clemens kept cleaning, because someone had to, because the work was never finished, because the dirt never stopped coming, and the systems that produced it never stopped running, and the people who lived in the spaces between power and neglect deserved someone who showed up at 5:45 every morning and picked up what others threw away. He tied off the bag, opened a new one, moved to the next section. Behind him, the river moved south, the way it always had, carrying silt and history and the patient insistence of water against stone, the slowest force and the most permanent. But the email, the one that had surfaced in the FOIA response, the one with the deleted body and the subject line that read R.E. Bluff Park, Phase 2 Timeline, sat in a federal evidence file in the banker's box in Camille Thornton's hotel room. The sender field read Natchez PD-admin, an account that didn't correspond to any individual officer, an administrative address, a system address, the kind of account that routed through servers rather than desks. The body of the email had been deleted before the FOIA response was processed. Deletion required administrative access. Someone inside the system had reached into the records and removed the content while leaving the headers intact, either because they didn't know the headers would survive, or because they wanted them to survive, as a signal or a warning or a breadcrumb left by someone whose loyalties were more complicated than their job title suggested. Phase 2. What was Phase 2? The development was frozen. The rezoning was suspended. The alderman was under investigation, and the police captain had retired, and the maintenance chief was hiding behind medical paperwork. Phase 1, whatever it had been, was over. But the email existed. The headers existed. The administrative account existed. And somewhere in the server logs of the Natchez Police Department's internal network, the deletion timestamp existed too, evidence that someone had tried to erase something and had failed in the particular way that digital erasure always fails, leaving traces that the eraser didn't know were visible to people who knew where to look. Thornton had flagged the email, forwarded it to the FBI's cyber division for metadata analysis. The analysis would take weeks. The results would be, probably, inconclusive or classified, or routed into a parallel investigation that would proceed at the pace of federal bureaucracy, which was the pace of geology measured in calendar years. But the email was there. The question was there. The thread was pulled but not cut. And Josiah, who would leave Natchez in 5 weeks, who would take his crutch and his laptop and his files to the next city, who would clean the next park or walk the next neighborhood or sit in the next courtroom while someone else read the evidence he'd gathered, didn't know about Phase 2, didn't know about the email's deletion, didn't know that the system he'd exposed was larger than one park and deeper than one alderman and older than one development deal. He knew what he'd been trained to know, that the work was incremental, that the victories were partial, that the systems changed slowly when they changed at all, and that every assessment he completed was one brick in a foundation that other people would build on, or wouldn't, depending on political will and funding and the particular alchemy of public attention that determined which injustices got addressed and which got filed away. He knew that Jernigan might never be charged. The ethics review would take months. His attorney would file continuance after continuance, each one stretching the timeline until the public attention faded and the political consequences diminished, and the hearing became a formality rather than a reckoning. Jernigan would probably resign from the council before the hearing concluded, a quiet departure, framed as personal reasons, the kind of exit that preserved pension and reputation while avoiding the discomfort of a public finding. He knew that Overstreet would probably never face consequences for the 5911 calls. The DA's office had received Thornton's referral and had not, as of the council session, responded. The silence was its own answer. Prosecuting a white woman in the Bluffs for calling the police about a black man in a park was the kind of case that district attorneys in Mississippi, elected district attorneys, dependent on the votes of people who lived in neighborhoods like the Bluffs, chose not to pursue, not with a public statement, not with a formal declination. Just with silence. The referral would sit in a file. The file would sit in a drawer. The drawer would close. He knew that the federal monitor, appointed for 12 months starting in June, would produce a report. The report would contain recommendations. The recommendations would be implemented selectively. The easy ones first, the expensive ones never. The ones that required structural change deferred to a Phase 2 implementation timeline that would extend beyond the monitor's appointment and therefore beyond anyone's accountability. He knew that the park would be maintained for as long as the cameras were pointed at it, and then the cameras would leave, and the maintenance budget would shrink, and the grass would grow, and the cycle would begin again. Slower perhaps, quieter perhaps, but the same cycle. Neglect, opportunity, profit, the conversion of public good into private gain, performed not through conspiracy, but through the ordinary mechanisms of a system that valued property over people and efficiency over justice. He knew all of this, and he kept cleaning anyway, because the alternative was to stop. And stopping meant the park went back to what it had been, overgrown, abandoned, a monument to the particular cruelty of institutional indifference. And Josiah Clemens, who had lived with a body that fought him every day and had never once used that fight as a reason to quit, was not the kind of person who stopped. Not when the work was hard, not when the work was thankless, not when the work was dangerous, not when the people he was working for didn't know he was working for them, and wouldn't thank him if they did. The sun climbed, the mower hummed, the river moved south, and the file marked CRT-20-5-MS-0-4-1 stayed open. Not resolved, not closed, not finished, because the park was clean, but the dirt ran deeper than any one man with a crutch and a trash bag could reach. And in Natchez, Mississippi, where the bluffs looked down on the river, and the money looked down on the bluffs, and the law looked down on everyone who couldn't afford to look back, the reckoning was preliminary, the findings were pending, and the only thing that was certain was that someone had tried to bury the truth in a public park, and the truth had refused to stay underground. The morning light hit the magnolia tree. A water bottle sat on the bench. No note, no name. Just someone's refrigerator and someone's kindness, and the small, stubborn, impossible to extinguish belief that what you do when no one is paying you matters more than what you do when everyone is watching. Josiah opened the trash bag. The sun was warm on his left side, which was the side that felt warmth the way other people felt it, full and immediate. His right side felt it less. The muted version, the translation, the body's approximation of what sensation was supposed to be. He'd lived his whole life in that gap, between what the body was supposed to do and what it actually did, between what the system was supposed to protect and what it actually protected, between what justice was supposed to look like and what it actually looked like when the cameras were off and the monitors were gone and the letters stopped coming. He reached for a bottle cap lodged in the roots of the magnolia, bent at the waist, crutch steady, fingers closing, slowly, carefully, the way they always closed, with effort that was visible and a result that was small, and a commitment that was larger than anyone watching could have understood. He got it, dropped it in the bag, and he kept going.
Thank you for taking the time to watch this video today. If you found the content helpful, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss our upcoming episodes. If you have any questions or suggestions, feel free to leave a comment below. We are always here to listen.